It is December 1240, and the city of Kyiv is burning. Not a district, not a quarter. The entire city. One of the oldest and most important cities in the Christian East. A city that has stood for over 400 years. A city whose golden-domed churches and monasteries have drawn pilgrims and merchants from Constantinople to Scandinavia. All of it is being consumed. The smoke can be seen for miles across the frozen Dnieper plain. Inside the walls, or what remains of them, the Mongol army is conducting a systematic annihilation. The Great Church of the Tithes, the first stone church ever built in Kyiv, is packed with hundreds of people, families, priests, the elderly, the wounded, who have fled there as a last refuge, believing perhaps that God will protect them within his house. The Mongols do not care. The weight of the people crammed inside, combined with the structural damage from the bombardment, causes the walls to collapse. Everyone inside is crushed or buried alive. Those who survive the collapse are dragged out. The garrison is already gone. Dmytro, the military commander left in charge of the defense after the city's own prince fled weeks earlier, has fought stubbornly from the walls, but the Mongol siege engines, built and operated by captured Chinese and Persian engineers, have pounded breaches through the fortifications. Mongol assault troops have poured through, and the fighting has devolved from organized defense into block-by-block slaughter. 6 years later, when the papal envoy Giovanni di Plano Carpini passes through the region on his way to the Mongol capital at Karakorum, he will record what he sees at the site of Kyiv. He will describe a city that has essentially ceased to exist. He will count roughly 200 standing structures in a place that once held thousands. He will note countless human skulls and bones scattered across the fields outside the walls. He will call the destruction almost beyond belief. And Kyiv is not the first. It is not even close to the first. By the time the Mongol army reaches Kyiv in late 1240, it has already spent nearly 3 years methodically destroying every major population center in what is today Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, then a minor town. Chernihiv, Pereyaslav. Dozens of smaller cities and towns that simply disappear from the historical record. The Mongol campaign through Eastern Europe between 1237 and 1242 is one of the most devastating military operations in human history. And for the people caught in its path, particularly the women, it is a catastrophe almost beyond description. This is the story of what happened to the captured women of Eastern Europe during the Mongol invasions. It is told in Persian chronicles, in Russian chronicles, in the accounts of European travelers and diplomats, in Hungarian and Polish records, and in the letters of terrified churchmen who watched the destruction unfold from just beyond its reach. The accounts do not agree on every detail, but they agree on the pattern, and the pattern is consistent enough, across enough independent sources, that its broad outline is not seriously disputed by modern historians. To understand what happened to these women, you first have to understand the army that took them. And to understand that army, you have to understand how staggeringly unprepared Eastern Europe was for what was coming. In the 1230s, the lands that the Mongols call the Kipchak Steppe, and that Europeans know as the Wild Plains north of the Black Sea, are inhabited by a loose confederation of Turkic nomadic tribes, the Cumans, or Kipchaks. Beyond them, to the north and west, lie the principalities of Rus, Kyiv, Chernihiv, Halych Volhynia, Vladimir Suzdal, Novgorod, and others. These are not a unified state. They are a collection of competing, frequently warring principalities, bound by a shared language, a shared Orthodox Christian faith, and a shared dynasty, the descendants of Rurik, but divided by generations of internal conflict over succession, territory, and trade. The princes of Rus fight each other constantly. They form alliances, break them, form new ones. They hire Cuman cavalry to fight their rivals. They marry Cuman women to seal treaties. The idea that these fractured principalities might need to unite against an external threat is not foreign to them. They have faced steppe raiders before, including the Pechenegs and the Cumans themselves. But they have never faced anything remotely like what is now approaching from the east. The Mongol Empire in the 1230s is the most powerful military force on the planet, and it is not particularly close. Under Genghis Khan, who died in 1227, the Mongols conquered northern China. She destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire across Central Asia and Persia, and raided as far west as the Caucasus and the Crimea. Under his successor, Ogedei Khan, the empire has continued to expand. The Jin dynasty of northern China has been finished off. The Korean peninsula has been invaded. And now, at a great Kurultai in 1235, Ogedei has authorized the campaign that Mongol sources call the conquest of the western lands. The army assembled for this campaign is enormous. Estimates vary, but most modern historians place the total Mongol force at somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 warriors, drawn from across the empire. It is commanded by Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, through his eldest son Jochi. But the real operational commander, the general who plans the campaigns and directs the armies in the field, is Subutai. Subutai is, by almost any measure, one of the greatest military commanders in recorded history. He has been fighting since the early campaigns of Genghis Khan. He led the Mongol reconnaissance in force that swept through the Caucasus and into the Kipchak steppe in 1222 and 1223, culminating in the Battle of the Kalka River, where a combined Rus and Cuman army was annihilated. He knows the terrain. He knows the enemy. He has spent more than a decade preparing for this campaign. The princes of Rus have been warned. Cuman refugees fleeing the Mongol advance have told them what is coming. But the warnings are mostly ignored or dismissed or lost in the noise of internal politics. The Rus principalities do not mobilize a unified defense. They do not coordinate. Each prince looks to his own city, his own walls, his own army. And this is exactly what Subutai is counting on. The invasion begins in the winter of 1237, and the choice of season is itself a statement of Mongol capability. European armies generally do not campaign in winter. Roads become impassable, rivers flood, supply lines fail. But the Mongols are steppe nomads. They are accustomed to moving in extreme cold. And in Russia, winter offers a critical advantage. The rivers freeze. The vast network of rivers that would slow or block a summer advance becomes, in winter, a network of frozen highways. The Mongol cavalry can move faster across frozen Russia than any European army can move in summer. The first major city to fall is Ryazan. The Mongol army appears before its walls in mid-December 1237. The Prince of Ryazan, Yuri Ingvarovich, has sent appeals for help to the other Rus principalities. No help comes. Vladimir Suzdal, the most powerful northern principality, does not send troops. Chernihiv does not send troops. Ryazan stands alone. The siege lasts 5 days. On December 21st, 1237, the walls are breached and the Mongols pour in. The Russian chronicles, the Laurentian Chronicle, the Novgorod First Chronicle, and others describe what follows in language that is restrained by the standards of the time, but unmistakable in its meaning. The chronicles state that the Mongols killed all inhabitants without distinction of age or sex. They describe churches being burned with people locked inside. They describe nuns and priests' wives being seized and violated. They describe young women being taken from their families and distributed among the Mongol soldiers. the chronicle of the destruction of Ryazan. A later literary account that draws on earlier sources is more specific. It describes women of noble birth being dragged before Mongol commanders. It describes mothers being separated from children. It describes the city being so thoroughly destroyed that, in the chronicler's words, there was no one left to weep for the dead. And Ryazan is only the first 5 days of a campaign that will last 5 years. After Ryazan, the Mongol army moves north with terrifying speed. Kolomna falls. Moscow, then a small fortified town, falls and is burned. The army reaches the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal, the most powerful state in northeastern Rus, ruled by Grand Prince Yuri II. Yuri has gathered an army, but he has made a critical error. Instead of defending his capital, Vladimir, with his full force, he has marched north to the Sit River to assemble a larger coalition. He leaves his family, his wife, his sons, his daughter-in-law, inside the city. Vladimir falls on February 7th, 1238, after a siege of less than a week. The Mongols breach the walls and begin their standard procedure. The male population is killed or enslaved. The Grand Prince's family retreats to the Cathedral of the Dormition, the most sacred church in the city. The Mongols set the cathedral on fire. According to the chronicles, the Grand Princess, her daughters-in-law, her grandchildren, and hundreds of others who had sheltered with them, died in the flames and smoke. When Grand Prince Yuri learns what has happened to his capital and his family, it is already too late. His army is caught by a Mongol detachment at the Battle of the Sit River on March 4th, 1238. The Rus force is destroyed. Yuri is killed. His severed head is reportedly sent to Batu Khan. In the space of 3 months, the Mongols have dismantled the most powerful political structure in northeastern Rus. And the pattern that emerges from these first weeks of the campaign, the pattern that will repeat city after city, year after year, across the entire breadth of Eastern Europe, is already fully established. Cities that resist are destroyed. Male defenders are killed. Skilled laborers and craftsmen are separated and enslaved. And women, from princesses to peasants, are seized, assaulted, distributed, or marched eastward in columns. The Russian chronicles are not clinical documents. They are written by monks, by churchmen, by men who understood the destruction of churches and the violation of religious women as a spiritual catastrophe, not just a human one. When they describe what happened to women in these cities, they use formulaic language, phrases like, "They defiled the nuns and the priests' wives and good women before their relatives," that recurs almost identically across different chronicles written in different cities at different times. This repetition is not evidence of copying. It is evidence that the same things were happening everywhere the Mongol army went, and the chroniclers had developed a shared vocabulary of horror to describe it. But the chronicles also contain specific stories, individual women, named women, women whose fates were recorded because they were of high birth, or because their suffering was witnessed by someone who survived, or because what happened to them became symbolic of what happened to everyone. And the deeper you go into the campaign, as the Mongol army turns south toward Kiev and then west toward Hungary and Poland, the more detailed and more terrible those accounts become. Because what happens next is not just a continuation, it is an escalation. And the women of Hungary, Poland, and the Carpathian Basin are about to experience something that will haunt European memory for centuries. After the destruction of Vladimir Suzdal in the winter of 1238, the Mongol army does something that confuses modern readers, but makes perfect operational sense. It pauses. Not because it has been stopped, No force in northeastern Rus is capable of stopping it. But because the spring thaw is coming, the vast frozen rivers that served as highways for the Mongol cavalry are about to become swollen, impassable barriers of meltwater and mud. The forests of northern Russia, already difficult terrain for steppe cavalry, will become worse. Subutai understands this, and he pulls his forces back into the steppe to rest, refit, and absorb the enormous quantities of loot, livestock, and captives taken during the winter campaign. This pause is not mercy, it is logistics. During this period, the captives taken from Ryazan, Vladimir, Moscow, Suzdal, and dozens of smaller towns are sorted. This is a word that appears again and again in the sources: sorted. The Mongol army does not simply seize people and throw them into a mass. It categorizes them. Skilled workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, siege engineers, metal workers are identified and pulled aside. They will be put to work. Healthy men capable of physical labor are organized into forced labor battalions. These men will dig trenches, haul siege equipment, fill moats, and in many cases be driven ahead of the Mongol army as human shields during the next assault. And the women are divided along their own hierarchy. Women of noble birth or obvious wealth are typically claimed by senior commanders or sent to the households of Mongol princes. Young women considered attractive are distributed among officers and warriors as personal captives. Older women, women with children, women who are not claimed. Their fates vary, but the sources suggest that many are simply left behind in the ruins, shut or marched along with the baggage train under conditions that kill a significant number of them before they reach any destination. The Persian historian Juvaini, who wrote his account of the Mongol conquests within a generation of the events, describes this sorting process in the context of Central Asian cities. But the mechanism is identical in Eastern Europe. After a city falls, the population is driven out onto the plain. Men and women are separated. Then the distribution begins, following a rigid hierarchy that mirrors the Mongol military chain of command. The Khan and his senior commanders take first pick. Then the Tumen commanders, generals commanding units of 10,000. Then the Minghan commanders, leading units of 1,000. Down through the Jaghun commanders of 100, to the Arban commanders of 10. And every level of the army receives a share. It is orderly, it is methodical, and it treats human beings, specifically women, as a divisible resource, no different in principle from horses or bolts of silk. This system did not originate in Eastern Europe. It was standard Mongol practice, refined over 2 decades of conquest across China and Central Asia. But its application in the Rus lands and later in Hungary and Poland had particular characteristics shaped by the specific conditions of the Eastern European campaign. First, the sheer number of captives was enormous. Northeastern Rus was not a sparsely populated frontier. Cities like Vladimir, Ryazan, and Suzdal had populations of tens of thousands. The surrounding countryside held tens of thousands more. When the Mongol army swept through, it generated a volume of captives that strained even the Mongol system of distribution. The chroniclers describe long columns of people, primarily women and children, being marched eastward across the frozen steppe. Many died on the march. Cold, hunger, exhaustion, and violence along the way killed them in numbers that no source attempts to count precisely, but that every source describes as vast. Second, the treatment of captive women in Eastern Europe was shaped by the Mongol army's particular need for what can only be called disposable labor. The campaign through Rus and into Hungary was not a war of occupation in the traditional sense. The Mongols were not, at this stage, building a permanent administrative state in these lands. They were conducting a campaign of destruction designed to eliminate any military threat from the Western steppe and to extract maximum wealth in the shortest possible time. This meant that captive women who could not be easily transported back to the Mongol heartland were often subjected to the worst treatment, used and discarded during the campaign itself, with no expectation that they would survive it. The Russian chronicles record incidents that illustrate this with painful clarity. At the fall of Suzdal, which occurred just days before the fall of Vladimir in February 1238, the chronicles describe Mongol soldiers seizing women from the city and from the surrounding monasteries. Nuns, women who had taken religious vows and lived in enclosed communities, were specifically targeted. The Novgorod First Chronicle and the Laurentian Chronicle both reference the violation of nuns and abbesses in language that, while formulaic, is consistent across independent sources. These women were not being taken as long-term captives. They were being brutalized during the sack itself, in the immediate aftermath of the city's fall, as part of the general destruction. This is a point that needs to be understood clearly, because it distinguishes the Mongol treatment of captured women from the treatment common in many other medieval conflicts. In most medieval warfare, the sack of a city was chaotic. Soldiers broke discipline, looted, and committed violence largely on their own initiative, and commanders either could not or did not bother to stop them. The Mongol army was different. Discipline in the Mongol military was extraordinary by any standard, ancient or modern. Soldiers who broke ranks, disobeyed orders, or acted without authorization were punished severely, often with death. The Yasa, the legal code attributed to Genghis Khan, imposed strict rules on everything from the distribution of loot to the order of march. This means that when Mongol soldiers systematically assaulted captured women after the fall of a city, they were not acting against orders. They were acting within a system that permitted it. The distribution of captive women was part of the expected reward structure of the Mongol army. A soldier who distinguished himself in battle expected to receive a share of the spoils, and that share included people. The violence was not a breakdown of discipline. It was discipline functioning as designed. This is a distinction that matters enormously for understanding the scale and consistency of what happened. If the assaults on captured women had been acts of indiscipline, they would have been sporadic, uneven, concentrated in some cities and absent in others, depending on the quality of local commanders. Instead, they are recorded at virtually every city the Mongols took in Eastern Europe. The pattern is too consistent to be explained by anything other than systemic practice. Now, the Mongol army does not remain idle during the spring and summer of 1238. While the main force rests on the steppe, detachments continue operations. The Cumans, the Turkic nomads who inhabit the plains north of the Black Sea, are being systematically hunted. The Cumans are not city dwellers. They are mobile, dispersed across vast grasslands, and individually, they pose no threat to the Mongol army. But collectively, they represent a potential source of cavalry reinforcement for any future enemy coalition. Subutai wants them eliminated as a military factor. The Mongol pursuit of the Cumans drives tens of thousands of Cuman refugees westward. Many flee into the Kingdom of Hungary, where King Bela IV accepts them, partly out of Christian duty, partly because he sees 40,000 Cuman warriors as a useful addition to his own military strength. This decision will have consequences that no one in Hungary yet understands. Meanwhile, the Mongol intelligence network is already mapping the political landscape of Central Europe. Mongol spies and scouts, many of them merchants, travelers, and diplomats operating undercover, have been gathering information on Hungary, Poland, Bohemia, and the German states for years. The Mongols know the military strength of each kingdom. They know the internal rivalries. They know that King Bela IV of Hungary has quarreled with his own nobility, that the Hungarian barons resent the Cuman refugees, that the political unity of the kingdom is fragile. They know that the Duke of Poland, Henry the Pious, can raise a significant force, but that coordination between Poland and Hungary is weak. They know that the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, is locked in a bitter struggle with the papacy and is unlikely to intervene. This intelligence is not incidental to the campaign. It is the campaign. The Mongol military system treats information as a weapon of the first order. Before a single arrow is fired, the Mongols know more about their enemy than the enemy knows about itself. And when the army moves, it moves based on that knowledge, exploiting every fracture, every weakness, every gap in the enemy's coordination. By the autumn of 1240, the Mongol army is ready to resume major operations. The target is Kiev, and everything south and west of it. The campaign that follows will carry the Mongol army across the Carpathian Mountains and into the heart of Europe, into Hungary and Poland, and it will produce atrocities that European chroniclers will struggle to describe. The fall of Kiev in December 1240, which we have already touched on, is the gateway event. After Kiev, the Mongol army reorganizes and splits into multiple columns, a standard Mongol operational technique that allows them to cover enormous distances, attack multiple targets simultaneously, and prevent the enemy from concentrating its forces. One column, under Baidar and Khadan, sweeps north into Poland. The main force, under Batu and Subutai, drives west through the Carpathian passes into Hungary. The northern column hits Poland first. In March and April of 1241, Mongol forces burned Sandomierz, Krakow, and dozens of smaller towns. The speed of the advance is almost incomprehensible to the Polish defenders. Cities that expect weeks of warning get days or hours. The Mongol cavalry moves 40 to 60 miles per day, a rate that European armies cannot match and that European messengers can barely outrun. At Krakow, the population receives just enough warning to attempt a partial evacuation. Many flee. Those who cannot, the old, the sick, the slow, and many women with young children, are caught. The city is burned. The Dominican and Franciscan monasteries are sacked. The fate of the women left behind in Krakow is not described in surviving sources with the same detail as in the Russian chronicles, but the pattern of the campaign leaves little room for uncertainty. Every city that falls follows the same procedure. Every city produces the same categories of captives. Every city's women face the same sorting, the same distribution, the same violence. On April 9th, 1241, the northern Mongol column meets the army of Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia at the Battle of Legnica. Henry has assembled a coalition force: Polish knights, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic knights, and Bavarian miners recruited as infantry. It is the best army Poland can field on short notice. The Mongols destroy it completely. Henry is killed. His head is cut off, mounted on a lance, and paraded around the walls of Legnica. Short to 2 days later, on April 11th, the main Mongol army under Batu and Subutai meets the Hungarian army of King Bela IV at the Battle of Mohi on the Sajo River. This is the decisive engagement of the European campaign, and it demonstrates everything about Mongol tactical superiority in a single day of fighting. Bela has assembled a large army. Contemporary estimates range from 60,000 to 80,000, though modern historians generally revise these downward. The Hungarians are well-armed, well-mounted, and fighting on their own soil. They establish a fortified camp near the bridge over the Sajo and believe they hold a strong defensive position. Subutai turns their position into a death trap. Under cover of darkness, He sends a flanking force to cross the river at a ford several miles south of the bridge. At dawn, the Mongols launch a frontal assault on the bridge, using catapults and incendiary weapons to suppress the Hungarian defenders. While the Hungarians focus on the bridge, Subutai's flanking force crosses the river and begins to envelop the Hungarian camp from behind. The Hungarian army collapses. The fortified camp becomes a killing ground. Thousands of Hungarian soldiers are cut down as they flee. The Mongols pursue the retreating Hungarians for days, killing them in small groups across the countryside. Estimates of Hungarian dead range from 25,000 to 40,000, roughly half the entire army. King Bela himself barely escapes, fleeing south through Croatia to the Adriatic coast, eventually taking refuge on an island off the Dalmatian shore. Hungary is now wide open. There is no army between the Mongol force and the Atlantic Ocean. And for the next year, from April 1241 to the spring of 1242, the Mongols occupy the Hungarian plain and conduct a systematic devastation of the country that is among the worst demographic catastrophes in European history before the Black Death. It is during this occupation of Hungary that the accounts of what happens to captured women reach their most detailed and most harrowing. Because unlike the Russian campaign, where the Mongols moved through quickly, destroying cities and moving on, in Hungary they stay. For nearly a year, the Mongol army is encamped on the Hungarian plain, and the occupied population is subjected to a sustained campaign of extraction, forced labor, and systematic sexual violence that the surviving sources describe in terms of open horror. And the accounts that survive from Hungary, from Poland, from the monasteries and churches and refugee camps where the survivors eventually gather, tell a story that is not just about military conquest. It is about what happens when an entire civilian population, and specifically its women, becomes the property of an occupying army that views them not as people but as resources to be used, traded, and consumed. What those accounts describe is something that the people of Eastern Europe will not forget for 500 years. The Mongol occupation of Hungary between the spring of 1241 and the spring of 1242 is not a military occupation in any sense that a modern person would recognize. There is no administration. There are no governors appointed to manage the population. There are no decrees posted in town squares, no tax collectors dispatched to assess revenue, no effort whatsoever to maintain the functioning of Hungarian society. The Mongols are not here to rule Hungary. They are here to consume it. And the first thing consumed is the population itself. After the destruction of the Hungarian army at Mohi, the Mongol forces fan out across the Great Hungarian Plain, the Untold, and begin a process that the sources describe with a consistency that leaves no room for ambiguity. Towns and villages are surrounded. The inhabitants are driven out into the open. Men of military age are killed or pressed into labor gangs. Women and children are seized. Livestock is taken. Crops and stores are looted. Then the settlement is burned. This is not raiding in the conventional sense. Raiding implies speed. Hit, take what you can carry, leave. The Mongols are methodical. They are thorough. They operate in coordinated detachments that sweep designated sectors of territory, ensuring that nothing is missed. Settlements that are bypassed by one detachment are caught by the next. The Hungarian countryside, which is flat, open, and offers almost no natural defensive terrain, is perfectly suited to this kind of systematic clearance. The Friar Roger of Torre Maggiore, an Italian churchman who was living in Hungary during the invasion and who was himself captured by the Mongols, left an account called the Carmen Miserabile, the Song of Lamentation. that is one of the most detailed eyewitness descriptions of the occupation. Roger's account is valuable precisely because he is not writing from a distance. He was there, he saw what happened, and in some cases, he experienced it directly. Roger describes the initial phase of the occupation as a period of deliberate deception. In some areas, he writes, the Mongols did not immediately destroy everything. Instead, they sent messages to the populations hiding in forests and marshes, telling them to return to their homes, that they would be allowed to live in peace, that they should resume farming and prepare for the harvest. Some people, desperate and starving, believed these messages and returned. It was a trap. Once a sufficient number of people had gathered in the open, the Mongols moved in and seized them. Roger describes this tactic with bitter clarity. The Mongols used the population's own desire to survive against them. They understood that starving people hiding in forests would eventually have to come out, and that a false promise of safety would accelerate the process. Among those who were lured back and captured, the treatment followed the pattern already established in Russia. Men were killed or enslaved. Women were taken. But Roger adds details that the Russian chronicles do not provide, because Roger was close enough to observe the daily reality of Mongol captivity in a way that monastic chroniclers hundreds of miles away could not. He describes women being kept in groups, under guard, in the open camps that the Mongols established across the plain. He describes them being distributed among soldiers as personal property. He describes the violent consequences for women who resisted or tried to escape. And he describes something that other sources corroborate: the use of captured women as a deliberate tool of psychological warfare against populations that had not yet been taken. This last point requires explanation, because it reveals something important about how the Mongol command structure thought about captive populations. The Mongols understood terror. They did not stumble into it. They cultivated it deliberately, as a weapon that reduced the need for actual fighting. A city that surrendered without resistance could expect, though this was never guaranteed, somewhat less destructive treatment than a city that fought. A city that had heard detailed accounts of what happened to the last city that resisted was far more likely to surrender. The Mongols actively facilitated the spread of these accounts. They released selected prisoners specifically to carry stories of destruction to the next target. They allowed refugees to flee ahead of their advance, knowing that the refugees' terror would undermine the will to resist in whatever city they reached. Captured women played a specific role in this system. Women who had been seized, assaulted, and released, or who had escaped, carried not just stories but physical evidence of what the Mongol army did. Their presence in a refugee column was itself a message. When survivors from Ryazan or Vladimir or Kiev staggered into the next city, the women among them told a story without needing to speak a word. Their condition communicated what was coming more effectively than any formal demand for surrender. This was not accidental. The Mongol commanders understood that the violation of women carried a particular psychological weight in the Christian societies they were attacking. These were cultures in which female honor was closely tied to family honor, in which the assault on a woman was understood as an assault on her husband, her father, her entire lineage. By systematically targeting women, the Mongols were not just inflicting physical suffering. They were attacking the social and psychological foundations of the societies they conquered. A man who could not protect his wife, his daughters, his mother was, in the eyes of his community, unmanned. A community that could not protect its women was, in its own understanding, destroyed in a way that went beyond the loss of walls and buildings. So the Mongol commanders did not need to read European theology to understand this. They could observe its effects, and they could, and did, exploit it with calculated precision. In Hungary, this exploitation took several specific forms that the sources describe in enough detail to reconstruct. The first was the mass seizure of women during and immediately after the fall of a settlement. This was the standard practice, the same sorting and distribution that occurred at every captured city from China to Poland. In Hungary, the scale was enormous because the Mongol occupation lasted long enough to sweep virtually the entire lowland population. Roger of Torre Maggiore estimates that a large proportion of the Hungarian population east of the Danube was killed or captured during the occupation. Modern demographic studies suggest that Hungary lost between 20 and 50% of its total population during the Mongol invasion, with the losses concentrated heavily in the plains east of the Danube. The population of the affected regions may have been reduced by as much as 60 to 80%. These are not abstract statistics. They represent hundreds of thousands of individual human beings. And among the survivors, a disproportionate number were women and children, because the Mongol system killed men at a higher rate than women, and because women and children were more likely to be taken captive rather than killed outright. The second form was the sustained exploitation of captive women during the occupation itself. Unlike in Russia, where the Mongol army moved through relatively quickly, in Hungary, the army stayed for months. This meant that captive women were held for extended periods, subjected to ongoing violence, and in many cases forced to perform labor, cooking, carrying, tending livestock, in addition to the sexual violence that the sources describe as constant and systematic. Roger describes seeing groups of women held in Mongol camps who had been captive for weeks or months. He describes their physical condition in terms that make clear the cumulative effects of sustained abuse, exposure, and starvation. He describes women who had given up, who no longer attempted to resist or flee, who had been reduced to a state of passive compliance that he attributes to the sheer enormity of what they had endured. He also describes acts of resistance, women who killed themselves rather than submit, women who fought back and were killed for it, women who attempted to flee and were caught and punished in ways meant to discourage others from trying. These accounts of resistance are important because they counter any suggestion that the captured populations simply accepted their fate. They did not. But the Mongol system was designed to make resistance futile, and in most cases, it was. The third form was the use of captured women in the Mongol army's own logistical system. The Mongol army on campaign was not a purely military force. It traveled with enormous herds of horses, cattle, and sheep. It required vast quantities of food, fodder, and equipment. The labor of maintaining this system, tending animals, processing food, repairing equipment, setting up and breaking down camps, was enormous. And captive women were pressed into this labor alongside captive men. In this context, women were not just victims of sexual violence. They were forced laborers, performing grueling physical work under conditions that killed many of them. This dual exploitation, sexual and economic, is a feature of the Mongol treatment of captured women that distinguishes it from many other historical instances of wartime violence against women. In many conflicts, sexual violence is opportunistic, concentrated in the immediate aftermath of a battle or siege, and largely disconnected from the broader economic functioning of the victorious army. In the Mongol system, the two were intertwined. A captured woman was both a source of labor and a reward for service. She existed within a system that extracted value from her in every possible way, and that system was maintained not by individual cruelty, though individual cruelty was certainly present, but by institutional design. The Hungarian occupation also produced a phenomenon that the sources describe with particular horror: the fate of women in religious communities. Hungary in the 13th century had a substantial network of monasteries, convents, and religious houses. These communities were often located in isolated positions, on hilltops, in valleys, along rivers, that reflected their desire for contemplation and separation from the world. Many of them had no serious fortifications. They relied on their sacred status for protection. Against the Mongols, sacred status offered nothing. The accounts of what happened to Hungarian convents during the invasion are among the most disturbing passages in the surviving sources. Mongol detachments that encountered religious communities treated them the same way they treated any other settlement. The monks were killed, the nuns were seized, the buildings were burned. The consecrated status of the women who had taken vows of chastity and dedicated their lives to God, meant nothing to soldiers from a culture that did not share and did not care about Christian religious categories. For the European chroniclers who recorded these events, the violation of nuns was not just a crime against individual women, it was a crime against God. It represented, in their understanding, a spiritual catastrophe of the highest order. This is why the accounts of violence against religious women appear so prominently in the chronicles, not because it was worse than what happened to other women, but because the chroniclers understood it as a category of sacrilege that demanded specific documentation. But the violence was not limited to nuns, and it was not limited to the period of active conquest. The occupation of Hungary continued through the summer and autumn of 1241 and into the winter of 1241 to 1242. During this entire period, the Mongol army continued to sweep the countryside, hunt down populations in hiding, and extract captives from every corner of the occupied territory. And then, in the early spring of 1242, the Mongols do something that has puzzled historians for 800 years. They leave. The reasons for the Mongol withdrawal from Hungary have been debated extensively. The traditional explanation is that news arrived of the death of Ögedei Khan in December 1241, and that Batu Khan needed to return east to participate in the selection of a new great Khan. This is probably part of the explanation. Other factors include the difficulty of operating heavy cavalry in the forested and mountainous terrain west of the Hungarian plain, the logistical strain of maintaining a large army far from its base, and the possibility that Subutai assessed the strategic situation and concluded that a permanent occupation of Hungary was not yet feasible. Whatever the reason, the withdrawal changes nothing for the women already captured. They do not go home. They go east. She marched in long columns across the steppe toward the territories that Batu Khan is consolidating into what will become the Golden Horde, the western division of the Mongol Empire, stretching from the Ural Mountains to the borders of Hungary and Poland. These women, tens of thousands of them, possibly more, disappear from the European sources at this point. They enter the Mongol world, and in most cases, they never return. Their fates can be partially reconstructed from Mongol and Persian sources, from archaeological evidence, and from the accounts of European travelers who visited the Golden Horde in subsequent decades and encountered European women living in captivity. What those travelers found, and what it tells us about the long-term fate of the captured women of Eastern Europe, and is a story that has received far less attention than the battles and sieges. But it is, in many ways, the most important part of this history. Because the battles ended. The sieges ended. The burning cities were eventually rebuilt. But for the women who were taken, the war never ended. It simply changed form. The European travelers who reached the Mongol world in the years after the invasion of Eastern Europe found something they did not expect. They found Europeans. Giovanni di Plano Carpini, the Franciscan friar sent by Pope Innocent IV in 1245 to deliver a letter to the Great Khan, traveled across the entire breadth of the Mongol Empire, from Lyon to Karakorum and back. His journey took him through the territories of the Golden Horde, across the Central Asian steppe, and into the Mongol heartland. And at nearly every stop along the way, he encountered people who should not have been there. Russian women living in Mongol encampments, Hungarian captives serving in the households of Mongol nobles, craftsmen and laborers from a dozen European cities, pressed into service thousands of miles from home. Carpini's account is careful and observational. He is a diplomat, not a poet, and he records what he sees with a precision that makes his testimony valuable. He describes the conditions of these captives without dramatic embellishment, but with enough detail to make the reality clear. The European women he encounters are living as servants, concubines, and in some cases, wives of Mongol warriors. Their status varies enormously depending on who owns them and where they are in the Mongol social hierarchy. Some have been absorbed into Mongol households in a way that gives them a degree of stability, if not freedom. Others are living in conditions of open servitude, performing heavy labor and subject to ongoing abuse. Carpini notes something that later travelers will confirm, that the Mongol system of captivity is not uniform. It is hierarchical, and a captive woman's experience depends almost entirely on the status of the man who claims her. A woman taken by a senior commander or a member of the royal family may live in relative material comfort, with access to food, shelter, and even a degree of social standing within the Mongol household. A woman taken by a common soldier may be worked to exhaustion, traded to another soldier when her captor tires of her, or simply abandoned if she becomes too ill or too weak to be useful. This hierarchy mirrors the Mongol social structure itself. Mongol society is organized around the principle that everything flows from the Khan downward. Pasture, livestock, trade goods, and people are distributed according to rank, and a person's value, whether they are Mongol or captive, is determined by their usefulness to the person above them. For captured women, this means that their fate is entirely contingent on their perceived value. Young women considered attractive are valued as concubines. Women with useful skills, weaving, cooking, animal husbandry, are valued as laborers. Women who are neither young nor skilled occupy the lowest rung of a system that has no safety net and no mechanism for appeal. William of Rubruck, another Franciscan envoy who traveled to Karakorum in 1253, provides even more detailed observations. Rubruck is a sharper observer than Carpini, more willing to describe uncomfortable realities, and his account contains passages about the lives of captive European women that are startling in their specificity. He describes encountering a woman from Metz, a city in what is now northeastern France, living in the camp of a Mongol prince. She had been captured during the invasion of Hungary and transported east. By the time Rubruck meets her, she has been in captivity for over a decade. She has learned to speak Mongolian. She has adapted to the rhythms of nomadic life. She has, in the language of the source, made a place for herself within the Mongol household. But Rubruck does not romanticize her situation. He makes clear that her adaptation is a survival strategy, not a choice. She did not choose to be taken from her home. She transported thousands of miles across the steppe and placed in the household of a man from an alien culture. She adapted because the alternative was death. And she is, when Rubruck meets her, still a captive. She cannot leave. She cannot return home. Her life is bounded by the will of the man who owns her. Rubruck also describes encountering a Parisian goldsmith named Guillaume Boucher, a man who had been captured and brought to Karakorum to practice his craft. Boucher's wife is a woman he met in captivity, a European woman, possibly Hungarian, who was also a captive. Their marriage, if it can be called that, took place within the Mongol system. They live in Karakorum, they work, they have children, but they are not free. They exist at the pleasure of the Khan. We and their skills are the only thing that gives them value and therefore safety. These individual accounts are windows into a much larger reality. The Mongol Empire in the mid-13th century contains enormous numbers of displaced people, captives taken from every conquered territory, living in conditions that range from privileged servitude to grinding misery. The women among them are distributed across the entire empire, from the Russian steppe to the Chinese frontier. Many have been separated from their families permanently. Many have borne children fathered by their captors. Many have been traded, given as gifts, or sold. Because while the Mongol Empire does not have a formal slave market in the way that the Islamic world or the Roman Empire did, the exchange of captive labor, including women, is a routine feature of its economy. Yet, the scale of this displacement is difficult to grasp. The Mongol invasions of Eastern Europe alone generated captives numbering in the tens of thousands at minimum. The campaigns in China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East generated hundreds of thousands more. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire is the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and it is held together in part by a vast network of forced labor that includes enormous numbers of captive women from virtually every culture the Mongols have encountered. This is the context in which the fate of Eastern European women must be understood. They are not an isolated case. They are part of a system that was not designed specifically to target them, but that targeted them with devastating efficiency because it was designed to extract maximum value from every conquered population, and women were one of the primary categories of value. Now, there is a question that modern readers often ask at this point, and it deserves a direct answer. The question is whether the Mongol treatment of captured women was uniquely cruel by the standards of the time, or whether it was simply a more efficient version of what every medieval army did. The honest answer is that it was both. Sexual violence in warfare was not invented by the Mongols. It was endemic in medieval European conflicts, in the Crusades, in the wars of the Islamic world, in virtually every military culture of the period. The sack of a city, any city taken by any army, routinely included the assault of women. This was true of Christian armies, Muslim armies, pagan armies. It was understood, if not officially sanctioned, as a consequence of war. Chronicles from every culture document it, but the Mongol version differed in ways that are significant and that the sources consistently highlight. First, the scale. The Mongol Empire conquered more territory and more people in a shorter period than any military force before or since. The sheer number of women subjected to capture and assault dwarfs anything in the European or Islamic experience of the period. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire alone, a single campaign lasting roughly 3 years, produced captive populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Eastern European campaign added tens of thousands more. The Chinese campaigns, stretching over decades, added still more. No other military force of the era operated at this scale. Second, the systematization. In most medieval armies, sexual violence during a sack was chaotic, opportunistic, and time-limited. It happened in the hours or days after a city fell, and it tapered off as order was restored or the army moved on. In the Mongol system, the seizure and distribution of women was organized, hierarchical, and ongoing. It was not a temporary breakdown of discipline, but a permanent feature of the army's reward and logistics system. Women were sorted, categorized, distributed, transported, and maintained as captive labor over periods of months, years, and in many cases, the rest of their lives. Third, the geographic displacement. Most medieval captives, even those taken in war, remained within a broadly familiar cultural world. A French woman captured during a war between French lords was still in France. A Muslim woman captured during a conflict between Muslim states was still within the Islamic cultural sphere. The women captured by the Mongols were transported thousands of miles across cultural and linguistic boundaries so vast that return was effectively impossible. A Hungarian woman taken to Karakorum was not just a captive. She was an exile on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. Separated from her language, her faith, her family, and her entire world by distances that would take months to cross, even if she were free to try. This combination of scale, system, and displacement is what makes the Mongol treatment of captured women historically distinctive. It was not that individual acts of violence were more extreme than those committed by other armies, though in many cases they were. It was that the violence was embedded in a functioning institutional system that sustained it over time and across space in a way that no other medieval military organization could match. And that system had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate suffering of the women themselves. Because the mass capture and displacement of women had demographic, genetic, and social effects that reshaped the populations of Eastern Europe and Central Asia in ways that are still measurable today. Modern genetic studies have identified a distinct Central and East Asian genetic signature in the populations of Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, and other regions affected by the Mongol invasions. Some of this signature is attributable to the settlement of Mongol and Turkic populations in these regions after the conquest. But a significant portion is attributable to the children born of unions between Mongol warriors and captured women. Unions that were, overwhelmingly, non-consensual. The most famous genetic finding related to the Mongol conquests is the identification of a Y chromosome lineage, carried by an estimated 16 million men alive today, that appears to trace back to a single individual living in Mongolia roughly 800 years ago. The geneticists who identified this lineage have suggested cautiously that it may be attributable to Genghis Khan himself or to his close male relatives. Whether or not that specific attribution is correct, the broader finding is not in dispute. The Mongol conquests produced a massive expansion of certain Central Asian genetic lineages, and that expansion was driven in large part by the systematic seizure and impregnation of women from conquered populations. This is the genetic trace of what the chronicles describe. It is the physical, measurable, scientifically documented residue of a system that captured women by the tens of thousands, distributed them as property, and used them to produce the next generation of an empire. For the women of Eastern Europe who were taken between 1237 and 1242, this is the long arc of their story. Not just the horror of the initial capture, not just the violence of the sack and the forced march eastward, but the slow, grinding reality of life as a captive in a foreign world. Bearing children they did not choose to conceive, performing labor they did not choose to perform, living out their years in a society that valued them only for what could be extracted from them. Some of them survived, some adapted. Some found ways to carve out small spaces of autonomy within the system that held them. The woman from Metz whom William of Rubruck encountered had learned the language, had made herself useful, had found a way to endure. Whether that constitutes resilience or simply the human capacity to keep breathing under unbearable conditions is a question that the sources do not answer and that perhaps cannot be answered. But many did not survive. The death rate among captives, from the initial violence of capture, from the forced marches, from disease, to malnutrition, exposure, and ongoing abuse, was catastrophic. No precise figures exist, but every source that describes the captive columns heading east also describes the bodies left along the route. The steppes swallowed them. The women who disappeared into the Mongol Empire were not, in most cases, absorbed into a new life. They were consumed by a system that used them until they had nothing left to give, and then discarded them. And back in Eastern Europe, the societies they had been torn from were struggling to comprehend what had happened. The Mongols had withdrawn from Hungary and Poland, but they had not disappeared. The Golden Horde, Batu Khan's domain, sat on the western steppe like a permanent threat, and the principalities of Rus were now its tributaries, not paying annual tribute and sending their princes to the Horde's capital at Sarai to beg for the right to rule their own lands. The trauma of the invasion, and specifically the trauma inflicted on women, became embedded in the cultural memory of every affected society. And the ways in which that trauma was recorded, remembered, and transmitted tell us something important about how these societies understood what had happened to them and what it meant. That cultural reckoning is its own story, and it begins in the churches and monasteries where the survivors gathered to mourn what had been lost. The monasteries that survived the Mongol invasion became the places where memory was kept. Not every monastery survived. Across northeastern Rus, across Ukraine, across Hungary and Poland, and dozens of religious communities had been obliterated, their buildings burned, their inhabitants killed or scattered, their libraries destroyed. But those that endured, either because they were located in regions the Mongols bypassed or because they were rebuilt in the years after the withdrawal, became the institutions that recorded what had happened. And what they recorded was shaped by the particular way in which medieval Christian culture understood catastrophe. For the monastic chroniclers, the Mongol invasion was not primarily a military or political event. It was a spiritual one. It was punishment. God had permitted the destruction of Christian lands because Christian people had sinned, and the nature of the destruction, its totality, its savagery, and its targeting of churches and consecrated persons was understood as proportional to the severity of the sin that had provoked it. This interpretive framework shaped how the chroniclers wrote about every aspect of the invasion, including the treatment of women. When the Novgorod Chronicle or the Laurentian Chronicle describes the violation of nuns and priests' wives, it is not primarily making a forensic record of a war crime. It is making a theological argument. The desecration of consecrated women is presented as evidence of divine wrath, a sign that God has withdrawn his protection from his people because they have failed to deserve it. This framing has consequences for how we read these sources. On one hand, it means that the chroniclers took the treatment of women seriously. They documented it. They named it. They did not dismiss it or minimize it. The violation of women, especially religious women, was, in their understanding, among the most significant things that had happened, and it deserved prominent mention in the historical record. On the other hand, it means that the chroniclers were not primarily interested in the experiences of the women themselves. They were interested in what those experiences signified. The individual woman, her name, her age, her story, her fate, is almost always subordinated to the larger theological narrative. She appears in the chronicle not as a person but as a symbol, a marker of the depth of the catastrophe, evidence entered into a case that the chronicler is making about sin and punishment and the relationship between God and his people. And this is why the language used to describe the treatment of women in the Russian chronicles is so formulaic. Phrases like, "they defiled nuns and priests' wives," appear repeatedly, almost identically, across independent texts. The chroniclers are not trying to convey the specific individual reality of what happened to each woman. They are invoking a category of atrocity that their audience will immediately understand as spiritually significant. The formula is a shorthand, and like all shorthands, it simultaneously preserves and obscures. It tells us that the thing happened. It does not tell us what it felt like to the person it happened to. The Hungarian sources are somewhat different, and Roger of Torre Maggiore's Carmen Miserabile is the most important example of why. Roger is not a monastic chronicler writing from behind the walls of a scriptorium. He is a survivor. He was captured by the Mongols, held as a prisoner, and eventually escaped during the confusion of the withdrawal. His account is written from the inside, and it contains details that no second-hand chronicle could provide. Roger describes women he saw during his captivity. He describes their conditions. He describes the specific mechanisms of their captivity, how they were guarded, how they were moved, what happened when they tried to resist. He describes the Mongol soldiers who held them not as faceless instruments of divine punishment, but as individual men making individual choices within a system that enabled and encouraged those choices. One passage in Roger's account has drawn particular attention from modern historians. So he describes a group of captive women who were being held in a Mongol camp on the Hungarian plain. The women had been taken from various settlements over a period of weeks. They were guarded, but not chained. The open steppe itself was their prison, because there was nowhere to run. Roger describes them performing labor during the day and being subject to the demands of their captors at night. He describes the resignation in their faces. He describes women who had stopped eating, who had stopped speaking, who had withdrawn into a silence that he interprets as despair so complete that it had extinguished the will to live. Roger also describes a specific incident in which a group of Mongol soldiers argued over the distribution of captured women from a recently taken village. The argument was not about whether the women should be taken. That was not in question. It was about who had the right to claim specific women, and it was resolved by appeal to the ranking officer, who made the allocation according to the standard hierarchy. Roger describes this scene as though witnessing a dispute over livestock, and the comparison is clearly intentional. In the Mongol system, as Roger observed it, there was no functional distinction between the two. These ground-level observations matter because they move the historical record beyond the theological framework of the monastic chronicles and into the lived reality of captivity. Roger is not asking why God permitted this. He is describing what it looked like, sounded like, and felt like to be present while it was happening. And his account, while it covers only a small fraction of the total occupation, provides a texture and specificity that the broader chronicles lack. But Roger's account also has limitations. He is a male observer, and he is describing women's experiences from the outside. He cannot tell us what the captive women thought, felt, or said to each other. He can only tell us what he saw, and what he saw was filtered through his own position. As a man, as a churchman, as a European, in ways that inevitably shaped his perception. This is a problem that runs through the entire historical record of the Mongol treatment of women in Eastern Europe. We have no accounts written by the women themselves. Not one. No captured woman from Ryazan or Vladimir or Kiev or Krakow or the Hungarian plain left a written record of her experience. And this is not surprising. Literacy among women in 13th century Eastern Europe was rare outside religious communities, and even literate women who were captured would have had no means of writing while in captivity. But the absence is significant. Everything we know about what these women experienced comes to us through the eyes of men, monastic chroniclers, diplomats, fellow captives, and in some cases, the Mongol sources themselves. And every one of these male observers had his own reasons for recording what he recorded, and his own blind spots about what he did not. The Mongol sources present their own particular challenge. The secret history of the Mongols, the foundational narrative of the Mongol Empire, was composed sometime in the mid-13th century and is our closest thing to an insider account of Mongol culture and military practice. It describes the distribution of captive populations, including women, as a routine and unremarkable feature of warfare. It does not moralize about it. It does not condemn it. It simply records it as something that happens after a victory, alongside the distribution of horses and pasture land. This lack of moral commentary is itself revealing. The secret history was not written for a European audience. It was written for the Mongol elite, and it reflects their values and assumptions. In that value system, the seizure of women from a defeated enemy was a right earned by victory, no different in kind from the seizure of any other resource. And the concept that this might constitute a moral wrong, that the women themselves had rights that the act of conquest did not extinguish, is simply absent from the text. It is not argued against. It is not even acknowledged as a question. Persian historians like Juvaini and Rashid al-Din, who wrote their accounts of the Mongol conquests under Mongol patronage, occupy an uncomfortable middle ground. They record the mass capture of women, the distribution of captives, and the destruction of cities in considerable detail. They are often explicit about the sexual violence involved, but they write from within the Mongol system, as subjects of the Mongol Empire, and their accounts are shaped by the need to simultaneously document what happened and avoid offending their Mongol patrons. So the result is a kind of clinical detachment. They describe atrocities with precision but without condemnation, as though recording natural phenomena rather than human choices. Rashid al-Din, writing in the early 14th century in his monumental Compendium of Chronicles, describes the distribution of captive populations after the fall of cities in Central Asia and Persia in language that is almost bureaucratic. He lists numbers. He categorizes. He describes the mechanisms of sorting and allocation with the detachment of an accountant reviewing a ledger. But embedded in this bureaucratic language are details that make clear the human reality behind the numbers. Women separated from children, families broken apart, individuals assigned to owners who lived thousands of miles from each other, ensuring that the separation was permanent. Between these different sources, Russian, Hungarian, Persian, Mongol, and the accounts of European travelers, it is possible to reconstruct a fairly comprehensive picture of the Mongol system of captive management as it applied to women. The picture is not pretty, it is not ambiguous, and it reveals a system that was, in its essential functioning, designed to extract the maximum possible value from captured women through a combination of sexual exploitation, forced labor, and reproductive control. That last element, reproductive control, is something that the sources touch on, but that deserves more explicit discussion. Because the Mongol system did not just use captive women as laborers and sexual objects. It used them as producers of the next generation. And this was not incidental. It was structural. The Mongol Empire was, for most of its existence, a minority ruling a vast majority of conquered peoples. The Mongols themselves, ethnic Mongols from the steppe heartland, were never numerous. The most generous estimates place the total Mongol population at the time of Genghis Khan's rise at perhaps 1 to 2 million people. The empire they built eventually ruled over 100 million. This demographic imbalance was the central problem of Mongol governance, and one of the ways it was addressed was through the deliberate integration of conquered peoples into the Mongol population, a process in which captive women played an essential role. A Mongol warrior who took a captive woman as a wife or concubine produced children who were, within the Mongol system, Mongol. They belonged to his household, his clan, his lineage. They swelled the numbers of his family, and by extension, the numbers of the Mongol people. This was not a side effect of the system. It was one of its purposes. The mass capture of women was, among other things, a demographic strategy, a way of converting conquered populations into Mongol populations within a single generation. The genetic evidence bears this out. The expansion of Central Asian genetic lineages into Eastern European and Middle Eastern populations during the 13th and 14th centuries is consistent with a large-scale, sustained transfer of women from conquered populations into the Mongol ruling class. The children of these unions carried their fathers' lineages into the future, while the maternal lineages of the conquered populations were absorbed and, in many cases, statistically overwhelmed. For the women themselves, this meant something very specific. It meant that their captivity was not expected to be temporary. They were not hostages to be ransomed or prisoners to be exchanged. They were permanently incorporated into a new society, expected to bear children for their captors, and expected to raise those children as Mongols. Their own identities, their languages, their faiths, their cultural knowledge were not suppressed through any formal policy, but they were rendered irrelevant by the structure of their daily lives. A Hungarian woman living in a Mongol camp on the Kipchak steppe, surrounded by Mongolian speakers, following the rhythms of nomadic pastoral life, raising children who knew no other world. That woman's Hungarian identity did not need to be formally erased. It was simply overwhelmed. And this is perhaps the cruelest dimension of the entire system. Not the initial violence, as terrible as that was. Not the forced marches, the sorting, the distribution, but the slow, comprehensive dissolution of identity that followed. The women who were taken from Eastern Europe did not just lose their freedom. Over time, many of them lost everything that connected them to who they had been. Their languages faded. Their prayers went unanswered in churches that did not exist on the steppe. Their memories of home became stories told to children who could not understand them. The few European travelers who encountered these women decades after their capture describe people who exist between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, speaking Mongolian with traces of Hungarian or Russian, to practicing fragments of Christian worship in secret or in hybrid forms, mixed with Mongol shamanic traditions, aging in a landscape that bore no resemblance to the one they had been born in. William of Rubruck, meeting that woman from Metz in 1253, speaks with her through a shared language, French, and describes her as eager to talk, as though the act of speaking her own language with someone who understood it was itself a form of rescue, however temporary. She tells him about her life. She tells him about the journey east. She tells him about the household she lives in and the role she plays. And then Rubruck leaves, continuing his journey to Karakorum, and the woman from Metz returns to the life that was imposed on her, and she disappears from the historical record entirely. We do not know her name. We do not know when she died. We do not know if she ever saw another European again. She is one of thousands, tens of thousands. Women whose individual stories were never recorded, whose names were never written down, whose lives after capture exist only as statistical probabilities and genetic traces and brief, agonizing glimpses in the accounts of men who passed through their world and kept walking. And back in the lands they were taken from, the societies that survived the Mongol invasion were beginning to rebuild, physically, politically, and psychologically. But the rebuilding was shaped at every level by the memory of what had been lost and the responses that emerged, military, political, and cultural, would define Eastern Europe for centuries to come. Those responses begin in the rubble of the cities the Mongols destroyed, and they begin with a question that every surviving leader in the region was forced to confront. How do you make sure this never happens again? The answer to that question, how do you make sure this never happens again, was not theoretical. It was stone. In the years and decades following the Mongol withdrawal from Hungary in 1242, A building program began across Eastern Europe that would transform the physical landscape of the region. It was not coordinated by any single authority. It was not the product of a grand strategic plan. It was the accumulated response of hundreds of individual lords, princes, bishops, and communities who had learned the same lesson in the same terrible way: that wooden walls and open towns could not survive what the Mongols brought. King Bela IV of Hungary, she who had fled his own kingdom on horseback while the Mongol army burned it behind him, returned to a country that was barely recognizable. The Great Plain, the Untold, had been stripped of its population. Entire districts were empty. Villages that had existed for generations were gone, leaving nothing but ash marks and scattered bones. The kingdom's military nobility, the backbone of its feudal army, had been devastated at Mohi. The economy was shattered. The administrative apparatus of the state had collapsed. Bela understood, with a clarity born of personal catastrophe, that Hungary's pre-invasion defensive posture had been fatally inadequate. The kingdom had relied on a field army, heavy cavalry, the traditional strength of the Hungarian nobility, to meet invaders in open battle. Against the Mongols, that approach had resulted in the complete destruction of the army in a single afternoon. The Mongols were faster, more maneuverable, better coordinated, and tactically superior in open terrain. Meeting them in the field was suicide. The alternative was fortification. Not the wooden palisades and earthwork ramparts that had characterized most Hungarian and Rus defensive construction before the invasion, but stone. Stone castles, stone walls, stone towers positioned on high ground, at river crossings, at mountain passes, at every point where terrain could compensate for the Mongols' superiority in open-field warfare. Bela launched what historians have called the castle-building program of the 1240s and 1250s, though in truth, it extended well beyond his reign and well beyond Hungary. He granted permission and incentives to his nobles to build stone fortifications. He invited foreign settlers, Germans, Italians, and others, to repopulate the devastated plains and establish fortified towns. He reformed the military system to emphasize defensive capability rather than offensive striking power. And he did something that reveals just how deeply the invasion had marked Hungarian strategic thinking. He maintained diplomatic contact with the Golden Horde, sent his own daughter to marry a Cuman prince allied with the Mongols, and conducted a foreign policy built around the assumption that the Mongols would come back. Because everyone in Eastern Europe expected them to come back. This expectation was not paranoia, it was rational assessment. The Golden Horde, under Batu Khan and his successors, remained the dominant military power on the Western Steppe. Its armies continued to raid the borderlands of Rus, Poland, and Hungary throughout the second half of the 13th century. In 1259, a major Mongol force swept through Poland again, sacking Sandomierz, Krakow, and other cities in a campaign that was smaller than the 1241 invasion, but devastating enough to reinforce the lesson. In 1285, another Mongol force invaded Hungary itself, penetrating as far as Pest before being turned back, this time, critically, by the new stone fortifications that had been built in the intervening decades. That 1285 invasion is a turning point, and it illustrates the effectiveness of the defensive transformation that the trauma of 1241 had set in motion. The Mongol force that entered Hungary in 1285 was not substantially different from the force that had destroyed the country 44 years earlier. It used the same tactics: speed, encirclement, the exploitation of open terrain. But the terrain was no longer open in the same way. The Hungarian plain was now dotted with stone castles that the Mongol cavalry could not take quickly. The passes through the Carpathians were fortified. The population, instead of being caught in open villages, retreated into walled towns and hilltop fortresses that could hold out for weeks or months. The Mongols could still devastate the countryside. They could still burn fields and seize livestock. But they could not capture the fortified points, and without capturing those points, they could not hold the territory. The 1285 invasion ended in withdrawal, and it was the last major Mongol incursion into Hungary proper. The lesson was absorbed across the region. In Poland, the Bohemian lands, and the Western Rus principalities, the decades after the Mongol invasion saw a similar proliferation of stone fortifications. Kraków, which had been burned in 1241, was rebuilt with stone walls. Wrocław was fortified. New towns were established on defensible sites with stone construction from the outset. The entire defensive architecture of Central and Eastern Europe shifted in a single generation from wood and earth to stone. And the primary driver of that shift was the memory of what the Mongols had done. But fortification was only part of the response. The other part was human. The demographic catastrophe inflicted by the Mongol invasion, the killing of men, the capture and deportation of women, the destruction of the agricultural base, left enormous gaps in the population of the affected regions. These gaps had to be filled, and the method used to fill them would reshape the ethnic and cultural composition of Eastern Europe for centuries. In Hungary, Béla IV actively recruited settlers from Western Europe. German colonists, known collectively as Saxons in Transylvania and Zipser in the northern highlands, were invited to settle in the depopulated regions with grants of land, tax exemptions, and guarantees of self-governance. These German communities established towns, farms, and mining operations that became the economic backbone of the rebuilt kingdom. In some regions, particularly Transylvania and the Szepes district, the German settlers became the dominant population, and fundamentally altering the ethnic character of areas that had previously been Hungarian or Slavic. The Cumans, the Turkic nomads who had fled into Hungary before the Mongol invasion, were also settled on the depopulated plain. Béla had originally welcomed them as potential military allies, but their presence had caused friction with the Hungarian nobility before the invasion, and many had been expelled or had fled during the chaos. Now Béla brought them back and granted them lands on the Alfeld, where they established pastoral communities that maintained their distinct identity for centuries. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. The Hungarian king was settling Turkic nomads, cultural relatives of the Mongols themselves, on lands that the Mongols had emptied. In the Rus principalities, the demographic recovery was slower and more painful. The principalities of the northeast, Vladimir Suzdal, which would eventually evolve into the Grand Duchy of Moscow, were now tributaries of the Golden Horde. Their princes ruled only with Mongol permission, obtained by traveling to Sarai, the capital of the Horde, and performing ritual submission to the Khan. The tribute demanded was heavy, and it included not just gold and furs, but people. The Mongol demand for labor, craftsmen, and soldiers from its Rus tributaries continued for generations, and this demand included women. The chronicles of the later 13th and early 14th centuries contain scattered references to Rus women being sent to the Horde as part of tribute payments or diplomatic arrangements. These are not the mass seizures of the invasion period. They are smaller in scale, more targeted, more political. Princes sent daughters or female relatives to marry Mongol nobles as part of alliance building. Towns contributed people as part of their tax obligations. The mechanisms were different, but the underlying reality was the same. Women from the conquered populations continued to flow into the Mongol system long after the initial conquest was over. This ongoing extraction had cumulative effects. The principalities of Rus, already devastated by the invasion itself, continued to lose population to the horde for over 2 centuries. The demographic recovery that might have occurred naturally was suppressed by the constant drain of resources, human and material, demanded by the Mongol overlords. The cities that had been destroyed in the 1230s and 1240s were rebuilt, but many never regained their pre-invasion populations. Some, like Ryazan, were effectively refounded on new sites, the original locations having been so thoroughly destroyed that rebuilding in place was impractical. The social consequences of this sustained demographic loss were profound, and they fell disproportionately on women. Not because women were specifically targeted in the post-invasion period, but because the initial invasion had disrupted the gender balance of the affected populations so severely. The mass killing of men during the conquest, combined with the mass capture of women, had created communities in which women outnumbered men, sometimes dramatically. These communities had to reorganize themselves around this new reality. In the Rus principalities, the church played a critical role in this reorganization. Monasteries and convents became refuges for women who had no male relatives to support them. Widows, orphans, women who had been captured and released, or who had escaped. The expansion of female religious communities in the decades after the Mongol invasion is documented in the chronicles and in the records of ecclesiastical foundations, and it reflects the scale of the social disruption. Women who had lost husbands, fathers, and sons entered religious life not necessarily out of spiritual vocation, but because the convent was the only institution that could provide them with shelter, food, and a degree of physical safety. Some of these women were themselves survivors of Mongol captivity. The chronicles contain occasional references to women who returned from the horde, ransomed, and exchanged or escaped, and who entered religious life afterward. The specific circumstances of their return are rarely described in detail, but the fact of their entry into convents suggests that reintegration into normal social life was difficult or impossible. A woman who had been held captive by the Mongols, who had been subjected to the violence that captivity entailed, occupied an ambiguous social position. She was a victim, but in a culture that tied female honor to sexual purity, she was also, in the eyes of her community, compromised. The convent offered a way to resolve this ambiguity. By entering religious life, the woman placed herself outside the normal social categories of wife and mother, in a space where her past could be, if not forgotten, at least officially set aside. This pattern, the absorption of traumatized women into religious communities, is not unique to the aftermath of the Mongol invasions. It occurs after virtually every major medieval conflict that produces large numbers of displaced women. But the scale of it in Eastern Europe after 1240 is unusual, and it reflects the unusual scale of the catastrophe that preceded it. The cultural processing of the trauma took other forms as well. In the Russian literary tradition, the Mongol invasion gave rise to a body of texts that scholars call the literature of the Tatar yoke, a collection of chronicles, tales, sermons, and hagiographies that attempted to make sense of what had happened. Within this literature, the suffering of women occupies a specific and important place. The tale of the destruction of Ryazan, composed sometime in the late 13th or early 14th century, is one of the most powerful examples. It is not a chronicle in the strict sense. It is a literary work, combining historical fact with legendary embellishment to create a narrative of heroic resistance and tragic loss. Within this tale, the fate of the women of Ryazan is given extended treatment. The tale describes the wife of a Ryazan noble named Eupraxia, who, upon learning that the Mongols are coming for her, throws herself from the walls of her tower rather than be taken. She dies by her own choice, and the tale presents her death not as a tragedy, but as a triumph, a woman who chose death over the dishonor of capture. This literary treatment is revealing. It tells us that the culture understood capture by the Mongols as a fate worse than death for women, so much worse that suicide was preferable, and that a woman who chose suicide in these circumstances was to be honored rather than condemned. This is a significant statement in a Christian culture that officially prohibited suicide, and the fact that Eupraxia's death is presented positively in a text that circulated widely among Christian readers tells us how deep the horror of Mongol captivity ran. But it also tells us something else. It tells us that the culture valorized a specific response to the threat, resistance unto death, and implicitly judged those who did not or could not make that choice. The women who survived capture, who endured captivity, who adapted to life in the Mongol world, are absent from this literary tradition. They are not condemned. They are simply not present. The literature celebrates the women who died rather than submit, and is silent about the women who lived through what submission meant. This silence is itself a form of erasure, and it echoes across the centuries. The women who were taken, who survived the marches, who bore children in captivity, who lived out their lives on the steppe, left almost no trace in the cultural memory of the societies they were taken from. They became ghosts, present only in the demographic data and the genetic record, absent from the stories their own cultures told about what happened. And while the cultures of Eastern Europe were processing their trauma through theology, literature, and stone walls, the Mongol world was processing the same events in an entirely different way, as a story of success, an expansion, and the natural order of conquest. That divergence in memory, the same events understood as catastrophe by one side and as triumph by the other, is one of the defining features of the Mongol conquests. And understanding the Mongol perspective, uncomfortable as it is essential to understanding why the treatment of captured women took the form it did. The Mongol perspective on the conquest of Eastern Europe is preserved in sources that read very differently from the Russian chronicles or Roger of Torre Maggiore's lament. The secret history of the Mongols, the Altan debtor, and the accounts compiled by Persian historians working under Mongol patronage describe the same events, the same cities falling, the same populations being swept up, the same columns of captives heading east, but the emotional register is entirely different. There is no horror. There is no mourning. There is satisfaction. This is not because the Mongol sources are dishonest or because they deliberately conceal what happened. It is because the Mongol worldview understood conquest, including everything that came with it, as the natural and legitimate exercise of power granted by Tengri, the eternal blue sky, the supreme deity of the Mongol spiritual tradition. In this understanding, the Mongols were not aggressors. They were instruments of a divine mandate. The world belonged to the Khan by heavenly decree, and anyone who resisted that decree was in rebellion against the cosmic order. Their defeat, and everything that followed from it, was not a crime. It was correction, and this is not a justification offered after the fact. It is the operating ideology of the Mongol Empire from its inception. When Genghis Khan sent envoys to foreign rulers demanding submission, the letters they carried were explicit: submit to the will of heaven as expressed through the Khan, or face destruction. The choice was presented as binary. There was no middle ground, no negotiation, no alternative framework. You submitted, or you were destroyed. And if you were destroyed, everything that happened to your people, the killing of your men, the enslavement of your craftsmen, the seizure of your women, was your fault because you had chosen to resist. This ideology matters for understanding the treatment of captured women. because it removed, within the Mongol system, any moral barrier to that treatment. Tiga, a woman captured from a city that had resisted, was not an innocent victim in Mongol eyes. She was a resource legitimately claimed from a defeated enemy who had brought destruction upon himself by defying heaven's will. Her suffering was not the Mongol army's responsibility. It was the responsibility of whatever king or prince or city governor had chosen to resist rather than submit. This logic is circular and self-serving, but it was sincerely held, and it functioned as an effective moral framework for an army that needed to conduct large-scale violence without the psychological friction that guilt or doubt would create. A Mongol soldier distributing captive women among his comrades after the fall of Ryazan or Vladimir was not, in his own understanding, committing an atrocity. He was collecting what was owed to him by the order of the universe. The practical application of this ideology is visible in the way the Mongol military system handled the distribution of captives. It was not chaotic. It was not left to individual initiative. It was governed by the same rigid hierarchical discipline that governed every other aspect of Mongol military life. The Yasa, the great law code attributed to Genghis Khan, established clear rules about the division of spoils, including human captives. A percentage went to the Khan. A percentage went to the commanding generals. The remainder was distributed downward through the decimal organization of the army, to the Tumen, Minghan, Jaghun, and Arban commanders, with each level receiving its prescribed share. This system ensured two things. First, it ensured that every soldier had an incentive to fight, because every soldier could expect a tangible reward from victory. The promise of loot, including captive women, was a motivating force that the Mongol command structure deliberately cultivated. Second, it ensured that the distribution was orderly, which prevented the kind of internal conflict that could tear an army apart when discipline broke down during a sack. The Mongol army did not fight over captives because the system allocated captives before fighting over them became necessary. But the system also ensured something else, something darker. By making the seizure and distribution of women an official, regulated part of the army's reward structure, it made it invisible as a moral problem. It was not something that happened despite the rules. It was something that happened because of the rules. And that meant it could not be challenged from within the system. A Mongol officer who questioned the treatment of captive women was not raising an ethical concern. He was questioning the fundamental order of the army and, by extension, the will of heaven. That was not a challenge anyone was prepared to make. The Persian historians who recorded these events understood the system well enough to describe its mechanics in detail, even if they could not openly criticize it. Juvaini, writing his History of the World Conqueror in the 1250s, describes the aftermath of the fall of Urgench, one of the great cities of the Khwarezmian Empire, in terms that apply equally to the Eastern European campaign. He describes the population being driven out of the city. He describes the separation of men and women. He describes the skilled craftsmen being pulled aside. He describes the women being divided among the soldiers according to rank. And then he describes the remaining population, those who were neither skilled nor young nor female, being massacred. Juvaini writes this with a detachment that modern readers often find chilling, but his detachment is not indifference. It is the voice of a man writing under the patronage of the system he is describing, who understands that explicit moral condemnation would cost him his career and possibly his life. What Juvaini does instead is let the facts speak. He describes what happened in enough detail that any reader can draw their own conclusions, while maintaining a tone that does not directly challenge the legitimacy of the Mongol enterprise. It is a form of witness that operates under constraint, and it is more powerful for its restraint. Rashid al-Din, writing a generation later, is even more comprehensive. His compendium of chronicles, commissioned by the Mongol Ilkhan Ghazan in the early 14th century, is the single most ambitious attempt to write a universal history of the Mongol Empire. It covers every campaign, every conquest, every ruler, drawing on Mongol, Persian, Chinese, and other sources. Within this vast work, the treatment of captured populations, including women, is described with a thoroughness that borders on the encyclopedic. Rashid al-Din records, for example, that after the Mongol conquest of a given region, the captured population was typically divided into categories that he enumerates with administrative precision. There were the craftsmen, who were sent to specific locations based on their skills. There were the laborers, who were assigned to construction projects, mining operations, or military logistics. There were the women, who were distributed according to the hierarchical system already described. And there were the children, who were in many cases separated from their mothers and raised in Mongol households, where they would be assimilated into the culture of their captors within a single generation. This separation of mothers and children appears in the Eastern European sources as well, though less systematically than in the Persian accounts. Roger of Torre Maggiore mentions it in the context of the Hungarian occupation. The Russian chronicles reference it obliquely. It is a detail that is easy to overlook in the larger narrative of destruction. But it represents one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the Mongol system of captive management. A woman who was captured and held as a concubine or laborer suffered enormously. A woman who was captured and then had her children taken from her suffered in a way that the sources struggle to articulate, falling back on phrases like unbearable grief and lamentations beyond description. The Mongol system did not separate mothers and children out of cruelty for its own sake. It did so for practical reasons. Children raised in Mongol households, separated from their mother's cultural influence, would grow up speaking Mongolian, following Mongol customs, and identifying with the Mongol world. They would become, within a generation, functionally Mongol. This was the assimilation machine at work. The same machine that had absorbed the Tatars, the Karaites, the Naimans, and dozens of other steppe peoples into the Mongol nation. Applied to the conquered populations of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, it was a tool of demographic engineering that operated at the level of individual families. For the women involved, the separation was permanent in most cases. A captured woman sent to one Mongol household, while her children were sent to another, possibly hundreds of miles away, had no way to find them, no way to communicate with them, and no authority to which she could appeal. The Mongol legal system, such as it was, recognized the property rights of the captor over the captive. A captive woman had no standing to demand the return of her children because she had no standing at all. She was property, and property does not make claims. This legal reality is important because it reveals the structural foundation of the Mongol treatment of captured women. It was not simply a matter of individual soldiers committing individual acts of violence. It was a legal system, a social system, and an economic system that defined captured women as property and then treated them accordingly. The violence was not a deviation from the system. It was the system functioning as intended. And that system continued to function long after the initial conquests were over. The Golden Horde, which controlled the western steppe and maintained suzerainty over the Rus principalities from the 1240s through the late 15th century, perpetuated the capture and trade of human beings, including women, as a central feature of its economy. The slave trade through the Golden Horde's territories was extensive, feeding markets in Central Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Women from Eastern Europe, Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Hungarians, Circassians, and others, were traded through these networks for centuries. The Italian trading colonies on the Black Sea coast Genoese and Venetian outposts at Kaffa, Tana, and Soldaya became major nodes in this trade. European merchants, Christians, participated in the buying and selling of captive women taken from Christian lands by Mongol and Tatar raiders. The moral gymnastics required to justify this participation were considerable, and the papacy periodically condemned the trade. But it continued because it was enormously profitable. A young woman from the Caucasus or the Rus borderlands could fetch a high price in the slave markets of Egypt, where the Mamluk Sultanate had an insatiable demand for slaves of both sexes. This trade was the long tail of the Mongol conquest of Eastern Europe. The initial invasion of 1237 to 1242 had established the political and military framework. Mongol dominance over the steppe, tributary status for the Rus principalities, the disruption of existing power structures, and the slave trade that followed exploited that framework for generations. Women who were taken in raids during the 1250s, 1260s, 1270s, and beyond were caught in a system that had its origins in the campaigns of Batu and Subutai, but that had evolved into a self-sustaining economic institution. The scale of this trade is difficult to quantify precisely, but it was not marginal. The Genoese records from Kaffa, which survive in fragmentary form, document thousands of slave transactions over the 13th and 14th centuries. Many of the slaves listed are women, and many are identified by ethnicity: Russian, Circassian, Cuman, Hungarian. Each entry represents a person, a life, a story that ends in the ledger of a merchant in a Black Sea port town, sold to a buyer whose identity and intentions are, in most cases, unrecorded. This is the commerce of aftermath. The Mongol invasion broke open the populations of Eastern Europe, and the trade in human beings that followed fed on the wreckage for 200 years. The women caught in this trade were not battlefield captives in the traditional sense. Many were taken in small-scale raids, border skirmishes, and punitive expeditions that never made it into the major chronicles. Their stories are even less visible than those of the women taken during the Great Invasion, because they were taken in ones and twos and dozens rather than in thousands, and because the system that absorbed them was commercial rather than military, quieter, more diffuse, and far more durable. And while this trade continued on the steppe and along the Black Sea coast, the societies of Eastern Europe were developing their own responses to the ongoing threat. Responses that were shaped, at every level, by the memory of what had happened to their women during the initial invasion and by the determination to prevent it from happening again. Those responses went beyond stone walls and military reform. They reached into law, into social custom, into the very way these societies organized themselves around the protection of their populations. And the structures they built, some of them remarkably effective, others deeply problematic in their own right, would define the character of Eastern European civilization for centuries to come. The next phase of this story is about those structures and about the price that was paid to build them. The price was centralization, and it was paid most visibly in the lands of Rus. Before the Mongol invasion, the principalities of Rus were fragmented, competitive, and politically decentralized. The princes of Vladimir, Kiev, Novgorod, Chernihiv, Halych, and dozens of smaller polities fought each other for supremacy within a system that had no effective central authority. This fragmentation was, in many ways, the defining characteristic of the Rus political world. It produced vibrant cultural competition, active trade networks, and a rich tradition of local governance. It also produced the strategic incoherence that made the Mongol conquest so swift and so total. The Mongols exploited this fragmentation with devastating precision. They defeated the Rus principalities one at a time, in sequence, moving too fast for any coalition to form. Each prince waited behind his own walls, hoping the storm would pass him by, and each prince was destroyed in turn. The lesson was unmistakable. Division meant death. And the principality that absorbed this lesson most thoroughly and that acted on it most ruthlessly was Moscow. Moscow in the 1230s was a minor town. It had no particular strategic importance, no great wealth, no storied history. But it had two advantages that would prove decisive over the next 2 centuries. First, its geographic position in the forested interior of northeastern Rus gave it a degree of natural protection from steppe raiders. It was far enough north and deep enough in the forest belt that casual Mongol raids were less frequent there than on the open plains to the south. Second, its princes proved extraordinarily skilled at navigating the political requirements of Mongol overlordship. The princes of Moscow did not resist the Golden Horde. They collaborated with it. They traveled to Sarai, performed the required rituals of submission, paid their tribute on time, and positioned themselves as the Horde's most reliable agents in the Rus lands. In return, they received the Yarlik, the patent of authority, that designated them as the senior prince among the Rus tributaries, with the right to collect tribute from other principalities on the Horde's behalf. This collaboration was morally ambiguous at best. The princes of Moscow enforced Mongol demands on other Rus cities. They collected tribute that included goods, money, and in some periods, people. They suppressed rebellions against Mongol authority, most notably in 1327, when Ivan I of Moscow helped the Horde crush a revolt in the rival principality of Tver, earning himself the title of Grand Prince and establishing Moscow's supremacy over the other Rus states. But the collaboration served a purpose beyond mere self-enrichment. By establishing themselves as the intermediary between the Horde and the Rus principalities, the princes of Moscow accumulated the political authority and the financial resources to build something that had not existed before the Mongol invasion, a centralized Rus state. They used the Horde's own administrative framework as a template. They adopted Mongol practices of census-taking, taxation, and postal communication. They built a bureaucracy modeled, in part, on the bureaucracy of their overlords, and they used their growing power to absorb, annex, or subordinate the other Rus principalities, one by one, creating a consolidated political entity that would eventually become the Grand Duchy of Moscow, and later, the Russian state. This centralization was driven by many factors, but the memory of the Mongol invasion, and specifically the memory of what happened when Rus was divided, was among the most powerful. The argument for centralization was, at its core, a security argument. A unified state could field a unified army. A unified army could defend the population. A fragmented collection of petty principalities could not. The memory of Ryazan, of Vladimir, of Kyiv, cities that fell because no one came to help them, was the emotional engine that drove acceptance of Moscow's growing dominance, even among those who resented it. And the memory of what happened to the women of those cities was part of that engine. The chronicles that recorded the Mongol invasion were read aloud in churches. They were copied and recopied in monasteries. The stories of nuns violated, of mothers separated from children, of noble women dragged before Mongol commanders. These stories were kept alive not just as historical memory, but as warnings. They told the people of Rus what happened when the state failed to protect its people, and they made the case, implicitly but powerfully, that a strong central authority was necessary to prevent it from happening again. This is one of the deep ironies of the Mongol conquest of Eastern Europe. The invasion that destroyed the old political order also created the conditions for a new one, more centralized, more militarized, more authoritarian, that was in many ways shaped by the need to ensure that the catastrophe would not be repeated. The autocratic tendencies of the Russian state which would become increasingly pronounced over the following centuries, have many sources. But one of them is the Mongol invasion and the lesson it taught about the cost of political weakness. Hungary followed a different path, but the underlying logic was similar. Bela IV's reforms after the 1242 withdrawal were not just about building castles. They were about restructuring the kingdom's entire military and social system to create a more resilient defensive posture. Bela strengthened the power of the crown relative to the nobility. He reformed land tenure to tie military service more directly to landholding. He established new fortified towns with legal charters that guaranteed the rights of their inhabitants in exchange for military obligations. He created, in effect, a kingdom organized around the principle of defense in depth. Multiple layers of fortification, supported by a mobilized population, designed to absorb and slow an invasion rather than meet it in a single decisive battle. These reforms worked. When the Mongols returned in 1285, they found a Hungary that was fundamentally different from the one they had devastated in 1241. The stone castles held. The fortified towns resisted. The Mongol cavalry, unable to reduce these strong points quickly, was forced to operate in a hostile landscape where every position was contested and every withdrawal route was threatened. The invasion failed, and it failed because the defensive infrastructure that Bela had built and that his successors had maintained and expanded had changed the strategic calculus. Poland underwent a similar transformation, though with its own distinctive characteristics. The fragmentation of Poland into competing duchies, which had been its political reality since the early 12th century, was already being reversed before the Mongol invasion. But the invasion accelerated the process. With the experience of 1241, when the Polish duchies were unable to coordinate a unified defense, and when Duke Henry the Pious was killed at Legnica leading an improvised coalition, demonstrated the lethal cost of disunity in terms that could not be ignored. The rebuilding of Poland after the Mongol invasion was accompanied by a systematic program of German colonization and urban development that transformed the country's demographic and economic base. German settlers established towns under Magdeburg law across Silesia, Lesser Poland, and Greater Poland, creating a network of fortified urban centers that served as both economic engines and defensive strongpoints. The town of Krakow, burned in 1241, was refounded under Magdeburg law in 1257 and rebuilt with stone walls that would define its character for centuries. And this urban development had a specific demographic dimension that connects directly to the aftermath of the Mongol invasion. The towns established or rebuilt after 1241 were designed, among other things, to provide protected spaces for civilian populations, including women and children, during raids or invasions. The concept of the fortified town as a refuge for the surrounding countryside was not new, but the Mongol invasion gave it an urgency that it had not possessed before. Town walls were not just commercial infrastructure, they were survival infrastructure, built by societies that had learned exactly what happened to unprotected populations when a steppe army arrived. The social impact of this transformation extended into the daily lives of women in these rebuilt societies. The post-invasion period saw changes in legal protections, to inheritance rights, and social customs that reflected the new demographic realities. In Hungary, the resettlement programs brought new legal frameworks, particularly the German-derived town charters, that gave women in certain urban communities more defined property rights and legal protections than they had possessed under the old Hungarian customary law. These changes were not motivated by any proto-feminist impulse. They were practical responses to a situation in which many communities had lost a large portion of their male population and needed women to participate more actively in economic and legal life. In the Rus principalities under Mongol suzerainty, the situation was more complex. The ongoing tributary relationship with the Golden Horde meant that the threat to women had not ended with the withdrawal of the main army. Raids continued. Tribute demands continued. The border regions between the Rus principalities and the steppe remained zones of chronic insecurity, where the capture of people, including women, was an ongoing reality rather than a historical memory. The response in these border regions was the development of a military frontier culture that would eventually produce the Cossacks. Communities of armed settlers, many of them refugees from Mongol and Tatar raids, who established themselves in the contested zones along the Dnieper, the Don, and other rivers that marked the boundary between the settled Rus lands and the steppe. These communities were militarized by necessity. Every adult male was a warrior. Settlements were fortified. Scouting and early warning systems were maintained constantly. And the protection of women and children from capture was understood not as an abstract principle, but as a daily operational requirement. The Cossack communities that emerged in the 15th and 16th centuries were, in a very real sense, the final product of the trauma inflicted by the Mongol invasion 2 centuries earlier. They were the institutional answer to the question that the invasion had posed. How do you protect a population, and specifically its women, from a mobile, fast-moving enemy that can appear without warning and disappear before a conventional army can respond? The answer was to put warriors on the frontier permanently and to organize them in a way that allowed them to respond to raids in minutes rather than weeks. This frontier military culture shaped the identity of the affected regions in ways that persist to the present day. Ukraine, southern Russia, and the Don region developed cultural identities that were inseparable from the experience of living on a military frontier and the protection of the community from steppe raiders. A threat that explicitly included the capture of women was central to that identity. The songs, stories, and oral traditions of the Cossack communities are saturated with references to Tatar raids and the rescue of captive women, reflecting a lived experience that stretched across centuries. But the frontier was never fully secure. The Golden Horde fragmented in the 15th century into successor states: the Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, the Astrakhan Khanate, and others. But these successor states continued the practice of raiding and slave-taking that had characterized the horde itself. The Crimean Khanate, in particular, became one of the most prolific slave-raiding states in European history, conducting annual or near-annual raids into Poland, Lithuania, and the Rus borderlands that continued well into the 17th century. The primary objective of these raids was the capture of people for sale in the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. And the most valuable commodity in that market was women. The Crimean Tatar raids of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries represent the direct continuation of the system of capture and exploitation that the Mongol invasion had established in the 13th century. The scale was smaller in any individual raid, hundreds or low thousands of captives rather than the tens of thousands taken during the Great Invasion. But the cumulative effect over 3 centuries was staggering. Modern historians estimate that between the mid-15th century and the late 17th century, the Crimean Khanate captured and sold between 1.5 and 3 million people from the borderlands of Eastern Europe. A large proportion of these captives were women. These women were sold through Kaffa and other Black Sea ports to buyers across the Ottoman Empire and beyond. They ended up as domestic slaves in Istanbul, as concubines in the harems of Ottoman officials, as laborers in households from the Balkans to Egypt. Their fates were individual and varied, but the system that consumed them was the direct descendant of the system that Batu Khan and Subutai had brought to Eastern Europe in the winter of 1237. The chain of causation is unbroken. From the first Mongol assault on Ryazan to the last Crimean Tatar raid into Ukraine, The capture and trafficking of Eastern European women was a continuous phenomenon, sustained by the political and military structures that the Mongol conquest had created. The Golden Horde became the Crimean Khanate. The slave trade routes established in the 13th century were still functioning in the 17th. The women changed. The system that consumed them did not. And it was this system, not just the memory of the original invasion, but the ongoing, a living reality of the slave trade, that shaped the strategic priorities of every Eastern European state for half a millennium. The drive to control the steppe, to push the frontier southward, to eliminate the Crimean Khanate as a raiding threat. These were not abstract geopolitical objectives. They were, at their core, about ending the capture and enslavement of civilian populations, and specifically of women. When the Russian Empire finally conquered the Crimean Khanate in 1783, it was the end of a story that had begun 5.5 centuries earlier in the snow outside Ryazan. The strategic imperative that drove Catherine the Great's armies into the Crimea was the same imperative that had driven Bela IV to build stone castles and the Cossacks to establish their frontier communities, the imperative to protect a population from capture. That this imperative was intertwined with imperial ambition, territorial expansion, and the pursuit of warm water ports does not diminish its origins. The fear was real. The threat was real. And the women whose capture had sustained that threat for centuries were real, even though most of their names have been lost. But before we reach that endpoint, there is more to understand about the mechanics of the system itself, about how the capture of women functioned not just as a military practice, but as an economic institution that shaped trade routes, diplomatic relationships, and the internal politics of both the steppe states and the European kingdoms that bordered them. That economic dimension is where the full scale of the system becomes visible, and it is where the story becomes most difficult to look away from. The economics of the capture and sale of women from Eastern Europe operated on a scale that is difficult for modern readers to fully appreciate. This was not a marginal trade. It was not a side effect of warfare that produced occasional profits. It was a major economic sector, one of the primary revenue streams for the steppe states that practiced it, and a significant factor in the commercial networks of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the broader Islamic world. To understand how this worked, you have to follow the money, and the money leads from the steppe to the sea. The Golden Horde's capital at Sarai, located on the lower Volga, was one of the largest cities in the medieval world at its peak. Estimates of its population range from 75,000 to over 100,000. It was a commercial hub where goods from China, Central Asia, Persia, India, and Europe converged. Among those goods were human beings. The slave markets of Sarai handled captives from across the Horde's vast territory, and women from the Rus principalities, the Caucasus, and the Kipchak steppe were a consistent and highly valued commodity. From Sarai, captive women moved along several established trade routes. The most important ran south, through the Caucasus or across the Black Sea, to the markets of the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The Genoese and Venetian trading colonies on the Black Sea coast, particularly Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, served as the critical transfer points. These Italian merchant colonies operated under agreements with the Mongol authorities that gave them trading privileges in exchange for customs duties and political cooperation. The arrangement was straightforwardly commercial. The Genoese did not raid for slaves themselves. They bought them from Mongol and Tatar intermediaries who did. The records that survive from Kaffa, fragmentary as they are, provide a window into the mechanics of this trade. Notarial documents from the late 13th and 14th centuries record individual sales transactions. A typical entry might note the sale of a woman identified by name, age, ethnicity, and physical description, along with the price paid and the identity of the buyer. The prices varied significantly depending on the woman's age, appearance, health, and skills. Young women in good health commanded the highest prices. Older women, women with visible injuries or illnesses, and women with young children were valued lower. The ethnic identifications in these records are revealing. Women are listed as Russian, Circassian, Cuman, Alan, Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Greek, among other designations. The diversity reflects the reach of the rating system. Captives were being drawn from a vast geographic area stretching from the Hungarian plain to the Caucasus Mountains. Each ethnic identification represents a community that was being raided, a population that was being bled, and the cumulative entries in the Kaffa notarial records represent a steady, ongoing drain of women from the borderlands of Eastern Europe into the slave markets of the wider world. The largest single market for these women was Mamluk Egypt. The Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and Syria from 1250 to 1517, was a state literally built on slavery. The word Mamluk means owned, and the ruling military elite of the Sultanate was composed entirely of men who had been purchased as slaves, trained as soldiers, and elevated to positions of power. The Mamluk system required a constant supply of new slaves, both male and female, and the Black Sea trade was one of its primary sources. For the Mamluk elite, women from the Caucasus and Eastern Europe were particularly prized. Circassian and Russian women were considered among the most desirable in the Mediterranean slave market, and they commanded prices that reflected this demand. A young Circassian woman sold in Cairo in the 14th century could fetch a price equivalent to several years of a skilled craftsman's wages. This was not a trivial sum. It represented a significant investment, and it tells us something about the economic forces that sustained the raiding system. The profit margins were high enough to justify the risk and effort of raiding deep into Eastern European territory, transporting captives hundreds or thousands of miles overland and shipping them across the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire, which gradually displaced the Italian trading colonies and absorbed the remnants of the Golden Horde's successor states over the 15th and 16th centuries, continued and in many ways expanded this trade. The Ottoman system of household slavery created an enormous domestic market for captive women. Women from Eastern Europe served as domestic servants, concubines, and in some cases, wives in Ottoman households from Istanbul to Baghdad. The imperial harem itself, the household of the Ottoman Sultan, included women drawn from across the empire's vast territory, and women of Eastern European origin were consistently present among them. The most famous example is Roxolana, known in Ottoman sources as Hürrem Sultan, who rose from slavery to become the legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century. Roxolana was almost certainly of Ruthenian origin, from the borderlands of what is now western Ukraine, and she was almost certainly captured in a Crimean Tatar raid. Her story is often told as a tale of extraordinary personal agency and political skill, and it was. But it began with a teenage girl being seized from her home, transported to a slave market, and sold into the household of the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world. Her success within that system does not change the nature of the system itself. Roxolana is remembered because she became powerful. The thousands of women who followed the same initial path, capture, transport, sale, but who did not become powerful are not remembered. They lived and died in the households of their owners, their names unrecorded, their experiences undocumented. They are present in the Ottoman tax records as property, in household inventories as assets, in inheritance documents as items to be distributed among heirs. They are statistically visible and individually invisible. The economic incentive structure that sustained this trade shaped the behavior of the Crimean Khanate, the primary successor state to the Golden Horde in the Western Steppe, in ways that were directly observable and extensively documented. The Crimean Khans organized large-scale raids into Polish, Lithuanian, and Muscovite territory on a regular basis, sometimes annually, and the primary objective of these raids was the capture of people for sale. The raids were not random. They were planned military operations, targeting specific regions known to have vulnerable populations, timed to coincide with agricultural seasons when dispersed rural populations were most exposed, and executed with the speed and coordination that the steppe military tradition had perfected over centuries. The scale of individual raids could be enormous. In 1468, a Crimean Tatar raid into the borderlands of Poland-Lithuania captured an estimated population of several tens of thousands. In 1482, a raid on the territories around Kiev produced a similar haul. In 1521, a massive raid penetrated as deep as the outskirts of Moscow itself, capturing an enormous number of people. Each of these raids generated captive populations that were marched south to the Crimea and sold through the established trading networks. The proportion of women among these captives was consistently high. The raiders preferentially targeted women and children because they were more valuable in the slave markets and easier to transport than adult men, who were more likely to resist or attempt escape, and who fetched lower prices unless they possessed specific artisanal skills. A raiding force moving quickly through hostile territory wanted captives who could be moved fast and sold dear, and young women fit both criteria. The impact of these raids on the affected populations was cumulative and devastating. Communities in the border regions of Ukraine, southern Russia, and eastern Poland lived under constant threat. The raids disrupted agriculture, depopulated villages, and created a climate of chronic insecurity that stunted economic development and made normal social life precarious. Women in these communities lived with the specific personal knowledge that they and their daughters were the primary targets of the raiding system. This knowledge shaped behavior. It influenced where people settled, how communities organized their defenses, how women moved through the landscape, and how families made decisions about everything from marriage to seasonal migration. The defensive responses to this threat evolved over time. The Muscovite state, as it consolidated power in the 15th and 16th centuries, developed an increasingly sophisticated system of frontier defense. The Zasechnaya Cherta, the Great Abatis Line, was a system of fortified lines, watchtowers, forest barriers, and garrison towns that stretched across hundreds of miles of the southern frontier. Its purpose was specifically to detect and intercept Tatar raiding parties before they could reach the populated interior. The system was not a single wall, but a layered defense in depth. Shijir designed to slow the raiders' advance and give the population time to take shelter in fortified towns. The investment required to build and maintain this defensive system was enormous. It consumed a significant portion of the Muscovite state's military budget for generations. Thousands of soldiers were permanently stationed along the frontier. Watchtowers were manned around the clock. Signal fires were maintained to provide early warning. The entire system was oriented around a single strategic objective: preventing the capture of civilian populations, and specifically of women and children, by Tatar raiders. This is a point worth emphasizing. The defensive architecture of the early Russian state, the system that eventually evolved into the military apparatus of the Russian Empire, was shaped, in significant part, by the need to defend against slave raids. The fortified lines, the standing frontier garrisons, the intelligence networks, the rapid response cavalry forces. All of these were developed specifically to counter a threat whose primary manifestation was the capture and deportation of civilians. And among those civilians, women were the most economically valuable targets and therefore the most carefully protected. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth faced the same threat and developed its own responses. The borderlands of Ukraine, which were under Polish-Lithuanian sovereignty from the 14th through the 17th centuries, were organized as a military frontier. The Cossack communities that emerged in this zone, the Zaporozhian Cossacks of the Dnieper and the Don Cossacks further east, served as both the first line of defense against Tatar raids and, increasingly, as an offensive force that conducted its own raids into Crimean territory. The Cossack raids against the Crimean Khanate and the Ottoman coastal settlements were motivated in part by the desire to free captives. Cossack oral traditions, the dummy, the epic songs that preserved the memory of the frontier wars, are filled with stories of warriors rescuing women from Tatar captivity. These stories are often romanticized and embellished, but they reflect a genuine historical reality. The Cossacks did conduct raids on Crimean slave depots and Ottoman coastal towns, and they did recover captives, though the numbers were small relative to the total volume of the trade. The most famous of these rescue narratives involves the Cossack raid on Kaffa in 1616, in which a Zaporozhian fleet attacked the Crimean port and freed a reported number of captives. The actual scale of the liberation is debated by historians, but the event became a foundational story in Cossack identity, proof that the defenders of the frontier could strike back at the system that preyed on their people. But for every captive freed by a Cossack raid, hundreds more were sold through the markets and disappeared into the Ottoman world. The rescue narratives, powerful as they are, should not obscure the fundamental asymmetry of the system. The steppe raiders had the initiative. They chose when and where to strike. The defenders could react, but could not prevent every raid. And the economic incentives were so powerful, the profit from the sale of captive women so substantial, that no amount of defensive investment could fully eliminate the threat as long as the raiding states remained in existence. This is why the ultimate resolution of the crisis required not just defense but conquest. The Crimean Khanate had to be destroyed as a political entity before the raiding system could be ended. And the destruction of the Crimean Khanate required the kind of sustained military power that only a large, centralized state could project. Which brings us back to the centralizing dynamic that the original Mongol invasion had set in motion. The Russian Empire's conquest of the Crimea in 1783 was the culmination of a strategic process that had begun with the Mongol invasion 5.5 centuries earlier. The chain of causation is long and complex, mediated by centuries of political, economic, and military development. But the thread that runs through it, from the fall of Ryazan in 1237 to the fall of the Crimean Khanate in 1783, is the imperative to end the capture and enslavement of Eastern European civilians. And at the center of that imperative, from beginning to end, were the women whose capture had driven the entire system. The economic machinery that consumed them, the raiding, the sorting, the transport, the sale, though the distribution into households across the Islamic world, was one of the most durable and profitable systems of human exploitation in pre-modern history. It outlasted the Mongol Empire itself. It outlasted the Golden Horde. It adapted to new political structures, new trade routes, new market conditions, and it continued to function in recognizable form for 500 years. When it finally ended, it did not end because the moral arguments against it prevailed. It ended because the military balance shifted, because the centralized states of Eastern Europe finally accumulated enough power to destroy the raiding states that sustained it. The moral arguments were present. They had been present since the first monastic chronicler wrote about the violation of nuns in the ruins of Ryazan. But the moral arguments alone changed nothing. What changed was the balance of force. And that is a lesson that extends far beyond the specific history of the Mongol invasions. But before we draw that lesson, there is one more dimension of this story that needs to be examined: the internal experience of captivity itself, as reconstructed from the fragmentary sources that survive, and what it tells us about the human capacity to endure and adapt under conditions of extreme coercion. That is where this story becomes most personal and most difficult. The internal experience of captivity is the part of this history that the sources illuminate least and that matters most. We have the chronicles, with their formulaic language of violation and lament. We have the travelers' accounts, with their external observations of women living in Mongol and Tatar households. And we have the commercial records, with their clinical entries of sale prices and ethnic identifications. But we do not have the voices of the women themselves. What we have instead are fragments, scattered details, embedded in sources written for other purposes, that occasionally open a narrow window into what daily life looked like for a captured woman in the Mongol and post-Mongol world. These fragments are not a substitute for the testimony that does not exist, but they are what we have, and they deserve careful attention. The first thing the fragments tell us is that the experience of captivity was not uniform. This seems obvious, but it needs to be stated explicitly, because the tendency when discussing mass atrocity is to flatten individual experience into a single narrative of undifferentiated suffering. The women captured during the Mongol invasions and the subsequent centuries of raiding experienced a vast range of outcomes, from the relatively tolerable to the unimaginably brutal, and those outcomes depended on factors that were largely beyond their control: who captured them, where they were sent, what skills they possessed, how old they were, and the sheer randomness of individual circumstance. A woman captured in a Tatar raid on a Ukrainian village in the 15th century and sold to a wealthy Ottoman household in Istanbul might, over time, achieve a degree of material security that many free women in Eastern Europe did not possess. She might live in a large house, eat well, wear fine clothing, and even exercise influence within the household hierarchy. Ottoman domestic slavery, particularly for women in elite households, could involve a trajectory from initial servitude to manumission and even marriage. The legal mechanisms for this trajectory existed within Islamic law, and they were used with sufficient frequency that the possibility was real, not merely theoretical. But that trajectory began with capture. It began with violence. It began with the severing of every connection to home, family, language, and faith, and the material comfort that might eventually follow did not erase the foundational act of coercion that had placed the woman in that household. She had not chosen to be there. She could not choose to leave. Her relative comfort was contingent on the goodwill of her owner, and that goodwill could be withdrawn at any moment. She was, in the most fundamental sense, not free. And the distinction between comfortable captivity and genuine freedom is not a distinction that should be blurred. At the other end of the spectrum were women whose captivity offered no mitigation whatsoever. Women who were captured by common soldiers rather than officers. Women who were sold to buyers in rural areas or frontier outposts rather than wealthy urban households. Women who were resold multiple times, each transaction carrying them further from any possibility of rescue or return. Women who became ill, who were injured, who aged out of whatever value the system assigned to them and were discarded, literally abandoned, when they could no longer serve. The Persian sources contain occasional references to this discarding. Juvayni, describing the aftermath of Mongol conquests in Central Asia, notes that captives who became too weak to march were left by the roadside. He does not specify gender, but the context makes clear that women were among them. The Mongol army on the move could not afford to slow down for stragglers, and captives who could not keep pace were simply left behind, in open steppe, without food or water or shelter, with no realistic chance of survival. This practice continued in the later raiding period. Accounts of Crimean Tatar raids describe captive columns moving south toward the Crimea at speeds designed to outrun any pursuit. Captives who could not maintain the pace were killed or abandoned. Children too young to walk were sometimes killed outright because carrying them slowed the column. Women who collapsed from exhaustion were left where they fell. When the raiders operated under time pressure, the longer they remained in enemy territory, the greater the risk of interception. And this pressure translated directly into lethal indifference toward captives who could not keep up. Between these extremes, the Ottoman household and the steppe roadside, lay the vast middle range of captive experience. And it is in this middle range that the fragments in the sources are most revealing. Several themes emerge consistently across the available evidence. The first is linguistic isolation. A captured woman transported from her home community into a foreign cultural environment faced the immediate and overwhelming challenge of communication. She could not speak the language of her captors. She could not understand their commands, their customs, their expectations. She was functionally mute in her new environment, dependent on gestures and guesswork to navigate situations that could turn dangerous without warning. The process of language acquisition under these conditions was itself a survival skill. Women who learned the language of their captors quickly had better outcomes. They could anticipate demands, avoid misunderstandings, and make themselves useful in ways that increased their value and therefore their safety. Women who did not learn, or who learned slowly, remained at higher risk. The sources do not describe this process in detail, but the fact that European travelers like William of Rubruck encountered captive women who spoke fluent Mongolian after years of captivity tells us that language acquisition occurred, and that it was driven by the fundamental need to survive. The second theme is religious adaptation. The women captured from Eastern Europe were overwhelmingly Christian, Orthodox in the case of the Rus lands, Catholic in the case of Hungary and Poland. Their faith was, for many of them, the most important element of their identity, and the loss of access to Christian worship, Christian community, and Christian ritual was experienced as a profound spiritual crisis. The Mongol Empire was, in principle, religiously tolerant. The Yasa prohibited the persecution of any religion, and the Mongol Khans patronized Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, and shamanist clergy simultaneously. But tolerance at the policy level did not translate into accommodation at the individual level. A captive Christian woman living in a Mongol household on the steppe had no access to a church, no access to a priest, and no access to the sacraments that defined her spiritual life. She might pray privately. She might observe fragments of the liturgical calendar from memory, but she was cut off from the institutional structures of her faith, and over time, especially if she was isolated from other Christians, the practice of that faith inevitably eroded. The accounts of European travelers confirm this erosion. Carpini and Rubruck both describe encountering captive Christians in the Mongol world, who maintained some elements of their faith, but who had adapted or blended their practices with local customs. Rubruck describes a community of captive Europeans at Karakorum who had built a small chapel and who attempted to maintain Christian worship, but whose practices had diverged significantly from anything that a European bishop would have recognized. These were people improvising a faith from fragments, trying to preserve something essential about who they were in an environment that offered no support for that preservation. For women in particular, the pressure to adopt their captors' religious practices could be intense. A woman who became the wife or concubine of a Muslim man, as many did, particularly those sold into the Ottoman world, faced expectations of conversion to Islam. In some cases, conversion was coerced directly. In other cases, it was a practical necessity. A woman who converted gained legal protections under Islamic law that a non-Muslim slave did not possess, including the right to have her children recognized as free-born Muslims if their father was Muslim. The incentive to convert was therefore both spiritual and material, and many captive women did convert, though the sincerity and depth of these conversions varied enormously. The children born of these unions occupied a complex position. Under Mongol custom, the children of a captive woman belonged to the father's household and lineage, regardless of the mother's origin. Under Islamic law, as practiced in the Ottoman Empire and the Mamluk Sultanate, the children of a slave woman and a free Muslim man were born free. In either case, the children were raised in the culture of their father, not their mother. They spoke their father's language. They practiced their father's faith. They belonged to their father's world. For the mother, this meant watching her children grow into people she could not fully reach. A Russian woman in a Mongol household might speak to her children in Mongolian, raise them according to Mongol customs, and watch them grow up with no knowledge of or connection to the world she had come from. A Hungarian woman in an Ottoman household might see her children become Muslims, speak Turkish, and identify entirely with the society that had enslaved their mother. The cultural transmission that normally flows from mother to child was disrupted, sometimes completely, by the conditions of captivity. This is a form of loss that the chronicles and commercial records do not capture, because it is internal, cumulative, and invisible from the outside. A woman who has lost her language, her faith, her community, and her ability to transmit her identity to her children has lost something that cannot be measured in the same terms as physical suffering, but that is no less real. It is the loss of continuity, the severing of the thread that connects a person to their past and to their future. And for the women of Eastern Europe who were captured and transported into the Mongol and Ottoman worlds, this loss was not exceptional. It was the norm. The third theme that emerges from the fragments is physical endurance. Captive women were not simply held in place, they were put to work. In Mongol and Tatar pastoral society, the labor demands on women were substantial even under normal conditions. Mongol women were responsible for setting up and dismantling the jier, the portable felt tent that was the basic unit of nomadic housing. They tended livestock, processed dairy products, prepared food, made clothing, and managed the domestic economy of the household. These were physically demanding tasks and performed in extreme weather conditions, brutal cold in winter, intense heat in summer, with minimal equipment and no rest days. Captive women were expected to perform the same labor, often with less food, less clothing, and less shelter than the Mongol women of the household. They were, in effect, an additional labor force, and their treatment reflected their status at the bottom of the household hierarchy. A captive woman who could not perform her assigned tasks was of no use, and a captive of no use had no protection. The physical toll of this labor, combined with the effects of inadequate nutrition, exposure, and the ongoing stress of captivity, was severe. Women who entered captivity in good health deteriorated rapidly. The aging process accelerated. Chronic injuries went untreated. Diseases that might have been survivable under better conditions became fatal. The life expectancy of a captive woman in a Mongol or Tatar household was almost certainly lower than that of a free woman in the same environment, and the environment itself was harsh enough that the baseline life expectancy was not high. Roger of Torremaggiore's observations of captive women in Hungary, women who had stopped eating, who had stopped speaking, who had withdrawn into silence, describe a psychological state that modern medicine would recognize as severe depression or post-traumatic withdrawal. These women were not just physically exhausted, they were psychologically broken. The accumulation of trauma, the initial capture, the violence, the forced march, the separation from family, the ongoing abuse, the loss of everything familiar had overwhelmed their capacity to cope. And yet, some women did cope. Some survived. Some adapted in ways that allowed them not just to endure, but to function, to build relationships within the households that held them, to find small spaces of autonomy and even connection. The woman from Metz whom Rubruck encountered had done this. She had learned the language. She had made herself useful. She had found a way to exist within the system without being entirely consumed by it. Whether this represents resilience or merely the biological imperative to keep living in the absence of any alternative is a question that the sources cannot answer. But her survival, and the survival of others like her, is itself a form of testimony, evidence that the human capacity to adapt extends even to conditions that seem designed to destroy it. The final theme that the fragments illuminate is the question of return. Of all the dimensions of captive experience, this is perhaps the most painful, because for the overwhelming majority of captured women, return was not possible. The distances were too great. The political barriers were insurmountable. The Mongol and Ottoman systems had no mechanism for repatriation, and the states from which the women had been taken had, in most cases, no capacity to recover them. There were exceptions. Throughout the period of the Crimean Khanate's raiding, ransoming was an established practice. Families, communities, and sometimes states paid for the return of specific captives. To the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Muscovite state, both maintained funds and diplomatic channels dedicated to ransoming captives from the Crimea. The process was slow, expensive, and uncertain. Negotiations could take years, prices were high, and there was no guarantee that a specific captive was still alive or locatable by the time ransom was offered. The ransomed captives who did return faced their own challenges. A woman who had been held in captivity for years, who had possibly borne children to her captor, who had been forced to convert to Islam, who had lived in a world entirely alien to the one she returned to. This woman did not simply resume her old life. She returned to a community that might view her with sympathy, or with suspicion, or with a mixture of both. Her sexual history during captivity was a source of social stigma. Her possible conversion was a source of religious anxiety. Her children, if she had them and if she brought them with her, were a living reminder of what had been done to her. The Church attempted to address these complications through formal procedures. Orthodox and Catholic authorities developed protocols for the reintegration of returned captives, rituals of purification, rebaptism in cases of conversion, and guidelines for the treatment of children born in captivity. These protocols acknowledged the reality that the returned woman was not the same person who had been taken, and that her community needed a framework for accepting her back. But the protocols could not undo the experience itself. They could not restore the years lost. They could not erase the memories. And they could not bridge the gap between the woman who had been taken and the world she returned to, which had continued without her and which had, in many cases, already mourned her as dead. And for most captured women, even this imperfect return was not available. They remained where the system had placed them, in Mongol camps, in Tatar villages, in Ottoman households, in Egyptian markets. And they lived out their lives there, far from home, far from anyone who remembered who they had been before they were taken. Their absence from the historical record is not silence. It is the sound of a story that was never given the chance to be told. And the scale of that untold story, tens of thousands of individual lives, when each one a world of experience that vanished without a trace, is the true measure of what the Mongol conquest and its aftermath cost the women of Eastern Europe. But this story does not end in silence. It ends in consequence. Because the system that consumed these women also provoked the responses that eventually destroyed it. And those responses, military, political, cultural, reshaped Europe in ways that are still visible today. The final measure of this history is not the suffering it caused, though that suffering was immense. It is the world it created, the world that emerged from the wreckage, built by the survivors and their descendants, shaped by the memory of what had been lost and the determination to ensure it would never be lost again.